Chapter 184. Sometime after Diaz's wedding, the A Squad sent word that the B squadrons were to adjust their condition, stock up and inspect their equipment. The A Squad had personnel who would be testing their starships with the latest weapons. Due to the incident at Sector S, all 10 B squadrons temporarily returned to Vanguard's stronghold at Sector K, regardless of whether they were still on a mission or not. Vanguard B squadrons were all gathered together, which was a rare occurrence. Beaver, Yudi and the others had been watching from the sidelines when the A Squad sent over to equip the 6th Division with the new weapon system. The 6th Division's engineers were also watching carefully and seriously. After all, if they were to go out on a mission and something went wrong, there was no way the A Squad could come along and repair it. They would have to rely on themselves. Before this, the engineers and technicians of the 6th B Squadron had developed a few types of weapons and equipment based on those special ores. But this time, the A Squadron had developed something a little more sophisticated. They had modified the negative threats brought about by the previous weapon systems, and increased their attack power and defense power, while also increasing their own stability by a lot. Huimao yawned after watching for a while. He could basically understand these weapon systems by scanning them from the side, so it was boring to be called here by the Miantuan to watch the weapon installation. Huimao stuck out his butt, stretched his back and licked his lips. Then he decided to harass Silin at the lab. Right now Silin, Lycrabe and Tico were producing antibiotics together. The news from the A Squad indicated that they were about to depart again, so they had to produce the antibiotics before they departed. After all, the experimental conditions on the starship couldn't compare to the conditions here, and there were a lot of restrictions. Lycrabe's eyelids twitched as he watched Huimao walk in openly and jump onto the lab table in front of him while holding a test tube in his hand. How the hell did this guy pass the system inspection and come in? This cat had truly given him too many blows. Every time he saw this bastard cat, he couldn't help but want to slap it a few times. However, Carrie once told him that if this cat didn't know how to be beaten voluntarily, he might not be able to draw the gray cat even if there were 10 of him. What a blow! I say, Lord Wheeze, are you here for an inspection? Huimao glanced at Lycrabe lazily and yawned. Where's Silin? The captain just went to look for him. Lycrabe took away the small bottles beside Huimao. This is not a place for you to play. Be careful of the liquid, it will hurt. Before Lycrabe could finish, Huimao curled his claws and grabbed one of the vials. He sniffed it, and then handed it back to Lycrabe in disdain. Lycrabe shook his head helplessly and packed up the small bottles. Just as he was about to speak, Tico, who was in the sterile isolation room, started to rush him. Lycrabe took out the things he needed from the medicine cabinet. Beside him, there were 2 auxiliary robots helping to sort them out. Then he placed them in the passage and sent them in after a few layers of scanning and sterilization. Alright, let's go out and play. I still need to continue with my experiments. After that, Lycrabe walked to a small room outside the sterile isolation room to change into his isolation suit. Huimao did not stay in the room and left with his tail wagging. Watching Huimao leave the laboratory, Lycrabe breathed a sigh of relief. What a worrisome guy. After Huimao came out, he was about to go to the captain's office to look for Silin. However, he ran into Shueqiu on the way, and was called by Shueqiu to watch the fun. The so-called fun was Qifeng's awkward shooting. Carrie and Tang Qiuqiu were teaching Qifeng how to shoot. Qifeng's fingers were getting more and more flexible, and he was gradually accepting the way of life that belonged to humans. In addition to shooting, there was also the piloting of fighter jets. Qifeng and Tang Qiuqiu were learning how to pilot a fighter jet. Based on the current situation, the use of fighter jets might increase a lot in the future. As the main combat personnel, how could they not know how to pilot a fighter jet? They had to be familiar with it. If they made a mistake during a chaotic battle, not only would they lose their lives, they might even kill their comrades. Carrie pulled out the fatty who was secretly laughing in the corner, and tossed him a gun. This was a gun used by beginners, and it was much simpler. It was a metal bullet type, and its recoil wasn't that strong either. After getting the toy, Shueqiu was no longer in the mood to laugh at Qifeng. He picked up the gun with difficulty and began to practice shooting. 5 minutes later, Huimao was lying on the shelf next to him and yawned again. He tilted his head and looked for a long time before saying, Clumsy. The fatty's round ears twitched as he turned to look at Huimao. How much better do you think you are than me? At least I can still pick up a gun. What about you? You can't even pick up a gun with your claws, can you? Huimao's ears flicked. He was obviously disdainful of this sentence. Why would I need a gun? He jumped down from the shelf and walked elegantly to Shueqio's side with his head held high. He looked at the target in the distance and moved a few steps towards it. He turned back to look at Shueqio. Continue shooting. Shueqio didn't know what it was going to do. He raised the gun with his two chubby hands and shot. Huimao's tail also flicked at a speed that was hard to see with the naked eye. Beep, 10 points. The system's voice rang out. This was the first time Shueqio heard the system's voice after shooting for half a day. He hadn't even touched the side of the target before. Shueqio's mouth opened and closed repeatedly. He scratched his butt and head. You did this. Although Shueqio wasn't good at shooting, it didn't mean that he was stupid. On the contrary, his IQ was very high. He naturally knew that he wouldn't be able to hit the target with his ability. Huimao sat there with a worship me look on his face. He was very proud. Amazing. Shueqio happily went up to ask for advice. Humans had their own methods, but beasts had their own as well. Techniques that were suitable for humans might not be suitable for them. While Huimao and Shueqio were discussing the shooting techniques of beasts, Silan was in Shotten's captain's office. The lieutenant commanders were all present, so Shotten conveyed the A Squadron's message to them. Since the incident at Sector S had come to an end, and all parties had calmed down, the A Squadron decided that the squads could move if they wanted to. However, there was a change now. The A Squadron hoped that the squads could work together and look after each other. It was too easy for a single B Squadron to get into trouble. 2 B Squadrons would form a group, and the 2 squads would coordinate the time and destination of the operation. They would also discuss and decide when to depart. 3 squadrons. The lieutenant commanders were puzzled. Why would 3 B squadrons volunteer to work together? Someone like Falvey wouldn't expect something like this to happen. However, when they recalled that Falvey had personally flown a plane to pick up Silan a while ago, the lieutenant commanders looked at Silan and pondered the reason behind it. Shotten tapped the table with his finger and said, "All right, let's not think about anything else. What I want to say right now is that 3 B squadrons have a job at Sector G. Falvey is asking for my opinion. After all, we need 2 squads to work together right now, and we haven't even finished our vacation according to our original plan yet. So I'm asking for your opinion right now. Do you want to continue your vacation? Or do you want to go according to our original plan? Or do you want to go with the 3rd B squadron? What is the 3rd B squadron planning to do at Sector G this time?" Akai asked. "They're going to ship a batch of T-13 ores to the Robert family. According to the agreement, they will receive a handsome reward and a batch of robots made from the T-13 ores. Of course we're going. We've rested for such a long time. And the people who received treatment at Sector E have returned safely. Right now, everyone's itching for a job. If it wasn't because of what happened a while ago, they would have applied for a trip outside a long time ago." Lieutenant Commander Lu Suo said. "I agree. Our bones will rust if we rest any longer," Laro said. Wachin agreed with their opinion. Zaya, Chasha, and Akai remained silent. Shotten turned his gaze to Silan. Although Silan was silent as well, Shotten knew that it wasn't that Silan hadn't made up his mind yet, but that he was still considering something. Sector G was the largest robot manufacturing center in the League of Stars. It was rich in a kind of ore, and it played an important role in the alloy material used to make robots. Several big families had built their manufacturing bases there. Noticing Shotten's gaze, Silan straightened his body and asked, "How much benefit will we get?" 46. "We'll get 30%, the 3rd squad 70%, and we'll get 20% for the robots. They'll get 80%. Shotten answered. "So little?" Akai was a little dissatisfied with the distribution. They're the ones who found the T-13 mine after all. If it wasn't for the A Squadron's arrangement, they would have gone alone. They don't want anyone else to share the profits. That's true. The lieutenant commanders began exchanging opinions. In the end, they all agreed to go. It was 2 B squadrons after all, so there shouldn't be any problems. Moreover, the profits they reaped from this operation were pretty good. After the group executive meeting, Sillin left Shotten's office and walked back. Sillin was thinking about the situation at Sector G. The Robert family was known as the Robot Kingdom in the League of Stars, and there were people in the family who worked in the military. Although they might not be able to compete with some of the other big families in terms of power, they were superior in technology, wealth, and background. These were the reasons why they were able to establish themselves as a big family in the League of Stars. Some people said that the Robert family members were born to work with robots, and Mo Hung had mentioned a few things about the Robert family back when Sillin was learning how to assemble parts from Mo Hung. Their assembly accuracy was no lower than 97%, and they were definitely a talented family. While he was thinking, he heard Huemao's voice. "Sillin, you're back." It was obvious that the guy was in a good mood. Huemao rushed over and climbed up Sillin's legs familiarly. He climbed up to his shoulder and slapped Sillin's back with a smug look on his face. "What is it now?" Sillin scratched Huemao's extended chin. "It's nothing. I just gave that white fatty some pointers, that's all." That was what Huemao said, but it was obvious that he was hinting for Sillin to praise it. "Heyo, Lord Cat, you've started teaching your students too." Sillin played along with Huemao's intentions. "Oh Sillin, why did Shotten look for you? Is it because there's work to be done?" "Bingo. Waha meow my, I really want to show off my skills now." "Ahem, it's not like I have to fight." Seeing Sillin looking at it sideways, Huemao corrected himself. "It's really annoying to be cooped up in here. If the squad wasn't busy, I would have suggested that you go out for a walk. There's no need for that now. The whole squad is on the move, but this time it's not just us. We're working with the 3rd B Squadron." While walking back, Sillin told Huemao about the operation and the robots at Sector G. This had undoubtedly piqued Huemao's interest, but Sillin also reminded Huemao not to expose his cyborg body unless it was absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the Robert family would not let him off the hook. Everyone in the 6th B Squadron became lively when they heard that there was a mission. Carrie, who had been listless for the past few days, was now on steroids again. Taking advantage of these few days of preparation, he summoned Chi Feng, Tang Qiuqiu, and Yudos over to teach them a good lesson. He explained how to handle some emergency situations during a mission. Before the operation, Lycrabe had finally produced an anti-growth drug with Tico's help. This undoubtedly boosted the 6th Division's confidence once more. Qifeng held his combat uniform and couldn't bear to let go of it. He especially liked the hole on the pants. There was an elastic band there, and it made it very easy to let his tail out. He put it on and tried it on. It was much more comfortable and sturdier than the clothes he passed to him before. He also had to choose his own weapon first. When Sillin returned from Sector S, he told Carrie about how his wrist was easily cut off by a sword. While Carrie marveled at the strength of the enemy's weapon, he also mourned the GL credits he had spent like water. Every squad had a new member for this operation, and Sillin's was the strangest of them all. There was a doctor, an apothecary, a couple of animals, and a non-human chiefeng. Yudos took out the emblem he had been hanging inside. He was very happy that he could finally hang it outside openly. The rendezvous with Falvey was at the spaceport outside the planet. The spaceplanes from the 2B squadrons flew towards the few starships parked at the spaceport. The squad members followed their lieutenant commander and flew into the starship. The moment they returned to the familiar starship, Huemao immediately began his long-awaited territory patrol. This time, he brought Xueqiu with him. The Miantuan and Whitey were standing on Xueqiu's head. Whitey the rabbit was munching on a carrot while observing the surrounding scenery. It didn't need to walk anyway, so it looked pretty relaxed. Since Qifeng was still young and unfamiliar with many things, he stayed in a small room at Sillin's place for now. If anything happened, Sillin would be able to help him. Xueqiu was obviously staying with Tang Qiuqiu, and the white rabbit was staying with Tico. But these animals would gather together to play every day, and the Miantuan was growing happier and happier. In the past he was alone, and when he was thrown out by Yudi, he could only lie in a corner and sleep all by himself. Later on, Huemao, then the white fatty Xueqiu, and now the rabbit had joined them. Their army was growing stronger and stronger. looking at the 4 animals lying there and playing a holographic flying chess game. Yudo's wiped his face. They've all become spirits. They've all become spirits. The small starships of the B squadrons had merged with their main starships, so there were only 2 starships belonging to the 3rd B squadron and the 6th division flying in space. Inside the main control room of the 3rd B squadron's main ship, Falvey sat on a chair and stared at the screen in front of him. He was as silent as ever, and the screen was displaying a 2-dimensional linear star path map of Sector G, but Falvey's thoughts were not on it right now. The reason Falvey treated Sillin differently was because Nada had told him some things about Sillin that day. Things that even Shotten didn't know about. Information about the 2 parasites and how to accurately control the decline and death of the parasite colony wasn't something that just anyone could do. Falvey had seen the specimens of the 2 parasites before, and he had heard the A Squadron's researchers' evaluation of the 2 parasites. Artificial, modified parasites were like terrifying weapons. They didn't need strong radiation energy or firepower, and if they were allowed to reproduce on a normal planet without implanting serial death genes that allowed them to perform programmed deaths at specific times like robots, they could destroy an entire planet in a serious case. Nada said that Sillin might be the only person in Vanguard who could continue Comunidin's parasite code according to its original standards. It wasn't that Falvey didn't know the value of the parasite code. On the contrary, he knew its importance very well, especially after Nada's words. Right now, Falvey's opinion of Sillin had changed a lot, and it was because of Nada's words that Falvey volunteered to cooperate with the 6th Division. That day, Nada looked at a document in her hands and said, Azrael has Godfather, but as long as Vanguard exists, there may be an existence that is not inferior to Godfather in the future as well. This existence was Sillin. While Falvey was thinking about Nada's evaluation of Sillin, the existence Nada spoke of was sleeping soundly in his own bedroom. Previously, he thought that he would have to absorb the information left behind by Comunidin in that state of sleep. But this time it was because he stayed up all night with Yudi and Beaver to study the prison's defense system at Sector S, and the reason why Fog, Wuxia and Azrael were able to hack into the prison's defense system and paralyze it. For the next few days, Yudi and Beaver couldn't take it anymore. They stopped twice to replenish their energy, but Sillin didn't stop even once. At that time, he only needed to close his eyes to be filled with densely packed programs and formulas. If someone were to listen to a couple of relevant numbers in Sillin's ears, he would immediately substitute the numbers into those complicated formulas and calculate the results. It was a conditioned reflex at the time. If it wasn't for Sillin, there was no telling how long it would take for Yudi and Beaver to finish their research. Right now, Sillin, Yudi and Beaver were all sleeping soundly on their own beds. They hadn't even cleaned their beards yet. Huimao jumped next to Sillin, scratched Sillin's messy hair with his claws and sniffed it. It smelled weird. How many days has it been since I washed my hair? Sneezing in disgust, Huimao jumped onto Qifeng's little bed, grabbed Qifeng's tail and curled his body into a ball. Then he too began to sleep. That chameleon said that the coming days might be harder, so he needed to conserve his strength. Yep, that's how he described it. Chapter 185. Their destination this time was the core planet of Sector G's Division F, Planet G, F100. It was medium in size, and although it was designated as the core planet of Division F, it wasn't actually a Rank A planet in terms of habitability. Instead, it was a slightly worse Rank B planet. The owner of Planet G F100 was called Robert Friends, and he was also the person who negotiated the contract with Falvey. The Robert family was a famous robot family in the League of Stars, but in reality, there were less than 100 of them in total. Compared to the other famous families in the League of Stars, they could be said to be the outlier of the outliers. Unlike the other families, the Robert family rarely had servants, bodyguards, and so on. Instead, they had high-fidelity robots, and a lot of people couldn't tell whether they were human or robot even if they were standing in front of them. They could even fool some scanners. In the past, they only learned about the Robert family through electronic publications and other people's stories. But today, it was obvious that the people of the 3rd B Squadron and the 6th Division were speechless. The starship was docked at the spaceport outside the planet. Only most of the main combat personnel, and a small number of support logistics personnel were heading there. Shotten had only brought 3 squads with him, and Silen's squad was one of them. Compared to Falvi's squad, Shotten's squad was a lot more low-key. After all, they could only be considered as companions, and they wouldn't steal the limelight. After they got off the spaceplane, Silen looked at the flock of birds flying across the sky. Those are robot birds. Huimao wasn't bothered by the fact that these birds weren't carbon-based life forms. On the contrary, he was actually quite happy. As a rare species in the universe, its diet was very wide. Of course it could eat carbon-based birds, but robot birds could be its food as well. It wasn't bad to change up his diet every once in a while. You'd better restrain yourself. These robot birds can detect the disappearance of even one of their monitors, and it'll be hard to explain when they trace their tracks back to you. Silen poked Huimao's forehead with a finger. I know, I'm just saying. Even if those robots speak, I'll pretend that I don't understand them. Huimao licked his claws and took a deep breath. What a familiar smell. The smell of machinery. The layout of this planet was similar to that of a planet with a level of habitability. In fact, it looked even more beautiful. After all, robots would not create a lot of household waste. On the vast grassland, there were some people herding sheep. The grass was real grass, and the sheep were real sheep. However, the people were not necessarily the same. Perhaps they were all robots that looked like ordinary people. Falvi led the group through a path on the grassland. He stopped and said, "Follow the left side of this planet." It's this point. The place where they were standing was surrounded by grassy plains. The shepherds from before were nowhere to be seen, and no one else could be seen. Since it was agreed beforehand, it should be here. Let's wait, Shotten said to the people from the 6th Division. Since the 2 captains had said so, the others did not refute and obediently waited where they were. Qifeng was very excited to see this grassland. The planet he was from did not have such a beautiful grassland. Many animals loved grassland. Xueqiu and Huimao were already rolling around on the grass, and Tico's little rabbit was released to eat. The Miantuan's body was the same color as the grass, so if one did not look closely, they would not be able to tell where it was. Actually, this planet was originally classified as a level B planet because of its lack of resources. However, under the influence of Robert Frenz and his mech kingdom, the classification gradually changed. After all, there are too few people on this planet to eat. Most people only need to absorb light energy, Shotten explained to the group. This is the surprising thing about the Robert family. Below this grassland is still the mech kingdom, Yudi said, looking at the screen of the scanner. After this planet was modified, it became Robert Frenz's kingdom, and Robert Frenz himself is the king of this planet. Listening to Shotten and Beaver's words, Silen also felt the movement coming from below the grassland. There was not much movement underground, and it could not be felt above the grassland. The reason why this grassland was so fertile was not only because of the light shield, but also because the original soil was barren. The nutrients needed for the growth of all kinds of plants were lacking, so the machines below had been constantly infusing nutrients into the soil. Improving the soil from underground was much more environmentally friendly than spraying on the surface, and the utilization rate was also much higher. This was also closer to the Robert family's standard of simulation. On the surface, it was closer to nature. However, modification was modification. No matter how realistic it was still modification. Once this modification stopped, everything would return to normal. The people of the Robert family loved to live in their own world. Not long after the group stopped, a flying car flew over from the distance. As it approached, it made a beautiful turn and stopped in the air in front of the group, slowly descending. A person walked out of the car. He looked very robust and had a warm smile on his face. After glancing at the people standing on the grassland, he walked straight towards Falvi. "Mr. Falvi, I'm really sorry to have kept you waiting for so long. The boss had some matters to attend to, so he couldn't make time to come over. I hope you don't mind," the man said loudly as he walked in front of Falvi and performed a noble's greeting. "My name is Carl. The boss sent me to pick you up. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carl. We didn't wait long." Falvi didn't show much expression on his face. Of course, it wasn't that he was angry. Falvey didn't have much of an expression to begin with. Carl was still smiling. After giving Falvey a simple explanation, he said, "Please follow me." Following Carl's voice, a flying car descended from the sky. Carl made a please gesture, but he didn't seem to have any intention of entering with them. There was an operator inside the flying car. After the two groups had boarded, the flying car took off. Carl jumped into the flying car and followed. The flying car brought them to a place that looked like a village. There were no tall buildings here, and it didn't have the bustling atmosphere of other planets. It was more like an isolated world. Everyone looked at the scene in front of them, and was a little surprised. The men were carrying bags of grain into the warehouse. The women were chatting and laughing. Some were hanging clothes next to the pomegranate trees. The children were playing games in groups of 3 to 5. The little ones were running around with some mud on their bodies. "These are all." Carrie was a little doubtful. "They are all robots," Yudi said. "They are all robots." Tang Kakikyo looked at everyone on both sides of the street curiously. These people were different from the robots she had seen before. This was too real. "Wah!" a child cried. A few children accidentally kicked another child when they were playing games. As a result, the child who was kicked didn't get the card he wanted. The sound of crying was really frightening, especially the tears that flowed from the eyes of the child, which made his face, which was originally covered in dirt, even more messy. Is this really a robot?" Carrie asked again. Yudi and Beaver didn't say anything. Because of the child's crying, a man walked out of the house and carried the child. He wiped the tears on the child's face and smiled. He took out a card and handed it to the child. Only then did the child, whose face was red from crying, stop crying and smile. Yudi and the others continued to stay silent. Even Shoten didn't make wild guesses now. Otherwise he would lose face if he said something wrong. Carl, who was leading the way, only smiled when he saw this scene and continued to lead the way. When they walked past the chair that the child had been sitting on, Sillin casually reached out and wiped a drop of the child's tear on the chair's handle. "What's wrong? What did you find?" Carrie came over and saw the liquid on Sillin's hand. "Is that a tear?" Huimao, who was originally lying on Sillin's shoulder, also became alert and stretched his neck over. Seeing this, Sillin directly wiped some of the liquid on his finger on Huimao's beard. Huimao shook his head in disgust. "Water." "Yes, water. That's all," Sillin said. Carrie didn't know how to react. "What do you mean?" Tico, who was wearing a white coat, came forward and explained. "If this is just water, then that child really is a robot. Human tears aren't just water. According to the types, there are basic, reflexive, emotional, and so on. For example, if you have dust in your eyes, you will cry, and the liquid in your eyes will clean the dust out. Another example is when you are sad or touched. They are all different, and the composition of the tear is different. Whether it's sodium, potassium, manganese, or other metals or enzymes, the composition of the tear will be different under different circumstances. This was the complexity of humans, unlike robots. Even if they behaved like robots, what they shed was just water. They wouldn't be as complicated as human tears. So that's how it is." Carrie nodded in understanding. "Even so, the robots of the Robert family are really amazing." Yudi sighed. It was too real. The feeling of touch and the protruding veins on the arm of the man, who was holding the child just now, all felt real. But these were all robots, the Robert family's robot kingdom. As long as there was a need, every one of them could instantly change their state and become a fighting tool that was no less dangerous than the 3rd and 6th teams. This was just Robert Frientz's robot kingdom. What about the other Robert family members' territories? They were all similar to this. If these robots were to be sold to the public, the price would be in the 8 digits, Beaver said. He knew the price of the special robots of the Robert family. "Let's see if we can buy an arm if we sell me," Carrie muttered. Lamenting the Robert family's robot kingdom, everyone followed Carl to a building that looked like an ancient castle. After entering, there were a few people wearing ancient knight uniforms standing on both sides of the aisle. When they saw Carl, they gave him an ancient salute. Inside the castle, there were a few people wearing knight uniforms. They were essentially robots. The robots in different positions were playing different roles. It was like a movie directed by Robert Frantz, and the people who came were all the characters in the movie. Those two robots are talking bad about us. After walking away, Huimao said angrily in Silen's ear. Only Silen heard it. What did they say? Silen raised his hand and scratched Huimao's chin. These robots didn't communicate with each other through words. Instead, they communicated through electromagnetic waves that were hard to detect for most people with A-rank genes. So, although the two people wearing night uniforms still had a serious expression on their faces, and their mouths were shut tight, in reality, the two of them had been communicating with each other for a long time. Wheeze narrowed its eyes from the scratches. They said that every single one of us was stupid, ugly, and that we actually brought animals with us. They said that Snowball was as fat as a ball, and that my fur color was ugly. Meow meow. They really don't know how to appreciate it. Huimao snorted. Don't bother with them. You are a few levels higher than them. Of course. Didn't you see that I pretended not to hear their conversation? That's called ignoring them, right? Huimao said proudly. Yes, yes. You did well today. Silen said. A cat should be stroked gently, or it would explode. Carl brought them to a hall. There were some delicately prepared food in the hall, and there were beautiful maids standing beside them. If they didn't know that 99% of the people here were robots, they would have been tempted. But now they could only focus their attention on the food. Of course, it was necessary to be vigilant. The two captains didn't bring them here to be gluttons or decorations. Carl said that Frantz was still busy, so he let them eat first. They didn't hold back at all. No matter what, the Robert family definitely didn't lack money. After eating, Carl asked Falvey and Schotten to enter the study. The others waited outside. After dinner, snacks and tea were served. At least this way, they wouldn't appear to be neglectful. Carrie despised this kind of face-saving project very much. However, despising was one thing, eating was another. That was why he didn't take much of the snacks and tea that were sent to him after the meal. Silen sat on a chair and drank his tea leisurely. Meanwhile, the gray cat was lying on Silen's shoulder and listening to the robot's gossip, with its ears perked up. In reality, other than people like Frantz who already knew the code to convert electromagnetic waves into signals, no one else would be able to decipher the electromagnetic waves even if they received them with instruments. Not even Silen knew what they meant. Wheeze's victory lay in its half-machine advantage, which was why it could understand the conversation. Listening to the gossip of the robots in the castle, Huimao tried to keep a straight face, but his trembling beard still let Silen know that he was holding it in. Don't hold it in. If you want to laugh, laugh. As long as it's not too exaggerated. No one will know that you're laughing at what the robots are saying, Silen said. Huimao grinned. He was about to tell Silen about the funny story he just heard, but his body suddenly froze. What's wrong? Silen noticed Huimao's abnormality. Huimao thought for a moment and said, Something's wrong. After a while, Huimao tried to maintain a normal expression on his cat face, but the words he said to Silen caused Silen's body to tense up. I just received an electromagnetic wave. It's very familiar, and it left a deep impression. I received this electromagnetic wave in the warehouse not long ago when we went to the level 3 prison planet at Sector S. Azrael. This was Silen's first reaction. He couldn't think of anyone else other than Azrael. After all, the defense system of that level 3 prison planet, be it on the ground or in outer space, had all collapsed. With such technology, one couldn't blame Silen for being nervous. After all, the fate of that level 3 prison planet was just too tragic. Keep listening, Silen said to Huimao. I know. Huimao was no longer giggling now. Because he had been controlling his expression all this time, no one could see anything wrong with him now. He made a vague gesture, and Yudi, Diaz and the others felt a chill in their hearts. Although they didn't know what was going on, the meaning behind Silen's gesture was too important. High alert. Why did he tell everyone to be on high alert? Tico saw Lycrabe's gesture, and then looked at the little rabbit whose ears were twitching inside his clothes. She sucked in a deep breath. We're in trouble, big trouble. Otherwise, Whitey's ears wouldn't be twitching like this. Tico had always known that the little rabbit had an ability to sense danger, and after living with it for so many years, she understood what the twitching of its ears meant. The people of the 3rd B Squadron also saw Silen's vague message. He looked like he was joking like before, but they were extremely prepared. They were all people who had experienced many things, so naturally they had their own ways of dealing with situations like this. There were robot maids standing around them, so they couldn't make it too obvious. Chiefing ate the food on his plate in big mouthfuls. His pointy ears were perked up, and his tail was no longer wagging as he paid attention to the situation around him. Silen stood up. Everyone around him looked at him and smiled at everyone. I just received news about a T-13 mine, and he told me to inform the commander and Commander Falvey. I think they'll be able to increase our price a little. No one believed Silen's words, but some of them could tell that the matter this time was related to the 2 commanders inside. The 2 commanders were in danger. I'll go with you, Carrie said. It wasn't just Carrie. The lieutenant commanders of both squads here had expressed the intention to go with them, but Silen refused. No need, I'll go inform them. You guys just wait here. There are so many people here after all. What he meant was that if something happened, you guys would have to lead the team members here. If everyone went, it would be troublesome, and it would be easier for him to act alone. Hearing Silen's words, the others did not insist. Yudos was a little nervous, but fortunately his head was lowered so that no one could see his nervousness. Beaver patted his shoulder and motioned for him to calm down. He looked up and smiled at Beaver. I'm fine, I just choked. After taking a few deep breaths, Yudos had calmed down a lot. Silen walked towards Frenz's study, and the maids showed no intention of stopping him. This puzzled Silen greatly. That shouldn't be the case. Chapter 186. Just now, Huimao had received an electromagnetic wave transmission that indicated that these robots were planning to rebel. However, what puzzled Silen was why they didn't rebel earlier or later, but instead waited for them to arrive. Also, was it Azrael's people who caused the robots to rebel? Although he couldn't be sure, Silen still had to be cautious when it came to matters involving Azrael. Otherwise he would regret it if they were all wiped out. A person dressed in a servant's uniform came over and led Silen to Frenz's study. Silen didn't deliberately look at the servant who led the way. This servant was also a robot, and he was also one of the rebels. From the looks of it, this servant was still playing the role that Frenz had given him. He was polite and had a smile on his face, looking very friendly. If Huimao hadn't received the electromagnetic wave from this servant, Silen wouldn't have guessed the robot's next goal. Standing at the door of Frenz's study, the servant pressed the notification bell. A light screen popped up on the door, showing the face of a middle-aged man. What's wrong? The middle-aged man asked. From his voice, it was obvious that he was dissatisfied with the interruption just now. This man was Robert Frenz. Master, this gentleman said he has something to tell those 2 about the T-13 mine, the servant replied respectfully. At this time, Falvey and Schotten, who were sitting inside, felt their hearts skip a beat. Frenz didn't set it to private mode, so Schotten and Falvey could clearly hear the conversation between the master and servant. They could also see Silen standing behind the servant outside. Because of this, they also knew that Silen wouldn't say something like that for no reason. Silen didn't know the details of the T-13 mine contract, so something must have happened. Although they both had their own thoughts, Falvey and Schotten didn't show it on their faces. Falvey took the initiative to cover up the lie with Silen. Frenz's expression softened a little, and he nodded. Since it's about the T-13 mine, let's talk inside. Following Frenz's voice, the door to the study opened, and Silen walked in. Schotten noticed that Silen's fingers that seemed to be hanging casually at the side of his body had vibrated very slightly. It was a very short period of time, less than 5 seconds. Within these 5 seconds, Silen had walked through the door, greeted Frenz, and performed a simple bow. But for Schotten and Falvey, the impact of these 5 seconds was too great. The code transmitted by Silen's fingers was, "High alert. The robots are rebelling. They want to kill Frunza." Frenz looked at Silen and was about to speak when suddenly, more than 10 gun barrels jumped out from Karl's arm and shot at Silen, Falvey, and Schotten. The servant who came and took out a high-energy lightsaber and a disc-shaped device in his other hand. He rushed to where Friends was sitting. There was a transparent energy shield there, and the servant threw the disc-shaped device at the energy shield. The disc sucked on the energy shield, causing it to become weaker and weaker. Friends, who was inside, obviously couldn't react to the current situation. He really couldn't understand why the robots would react this way. It wasn't until the energy shield dissipated, and the servant rushed over with the lightsaber that Friends thought of dodging. Sillin kicked the servant away, and chopped off the servant's wrist with the wrist knife in his hand. There was no blood at the cut area, but some fused fibers and transmission lines. The wrist knife in Sillin's hand was obtained from the stronghold. It was better than the wrist knife that had been destroyed like tofu, and he could still cut down the robot with ease. The robot didn't feel any pain when its wrist was chopped off, and its movements wouldn't slow down because of the wrist. Dodging the servant's sudden kick, Howren ducked to avoid the attack of the lightsaber, and at the same time, he slashed the servant's neck with the wrist knife. Although it wasn't completely cut off, it was almost there. Some of the lines were cut off, and the lightsaber in the servant's hand disappeared. However, Sillin didn't relax because of this. Sensing that something was wrong, he turned his head reflexively. Two beams of light brushed past the ends of Sillin's hair, which emitted a burning smell. The two high-density energy beams came from the servant's eyes. His neck was almost cut off, but he was still able to fight back like this. Sillin had no choice but to continue smashing. Yes, smash. He punched the servant's face again and again. When he fought with the servant just now, he knew that the robot's exterior was made of hard materials, so he could smash it with his bare hands. Only when the servant's entire head was smashed into a pancake did he put down his kicking leg and stop moving. Only then did he really die. Facing Carl's attack, the three people who were already prepared dodged in time and opened their energy shields. Before coming in, their guns were all placed in the storage box in front of the door, and they only had wrist knives and some small knives on them. But this was enough. If they could open their energy shields, they could get close to Carl and find an opportunity to kill him. While Sillin was fighting the servant, the two captain-level characters were fighting Carl at the same time, forcing him to keep retreating. In the end, Carl seemed to see the situation clearly and retreated. While there was movement on Sillin's side, the battle in the hall had also begun. The entire hall was a mess because of the battle between the two sides. That luxurious dining table had already been destroyed beyond recognition and turned into scraps. Chiefing had long since lost that naive look from before. Right now, his entire body was filled with a brutal aura. The long claws at the tip of his fingers directly penetrated a maid's heart, and then forcibly ripped it open. Watching the maid whose body had been split in half lying on the ground, Chiefing clawed at the maid's head again. Someone had been injured by the beams of light from these robots' eyes just now, and he didn't know if they were dead or not. Therefore, Chiefing was very cautious. He would completely destroy any threatening parts, and if one claw didn't work, he would follow up with a few more. Not far away, the people of Earth 3B Squadron who saw Chiefing's actions felt their eyelids twitch. This is too fucking brutal. Although Tang Qiuqiu didn't have Chiefing's brutal abilities, his marksmanship was excellent, and he was shooting almost non-stop. There was no so-called aiming time at all, and it was all based on touch and instinct. The modified bullets entered those robots' eyes and then exploded. Therefore, every shot Tang Qiuqiu fired was a true headshot. A headless robot would also have a certain degree of offensive ability, but it was indiscriminate. Not only did it attack the people of Team 3 and 6 team, it also attacked the other robots. This also lessened the burden on the others. There was also a white shadow scuttling around, and wherever the white shadow passed, there would always be robots sent flying, crashing into the ceiling or the surrounding walls. The walls didn't have any dents, but the robots were on the verge of falling apart, and those that didn't were also slow. Meanwhile, the starships outside the planet had also left the spaceport, avoiding the possible threat here. Before Sillin went to Frientz's study, he had already sent a message to the starships outside the planet. Of course, it was encrypted. Outsiders would see one message, but after the people in the team decrypted it, it would become another message. Sillin told them to pay close attention to the movements here, and to leave the spaceport once they found any abnormalities, and not to get involved with matters related to this planet. Reinforcements had to be arranged carefully, and they couldn't be killed in the air before they could come to the rescue. In the study, after getting rid of the servant and forcing Azrael away, Sillin briefly explained the development of the matter to Frentz. After all, it was a robot under Frentz's command that had betrayed them, and whether or not it was because of Azrael, the cause was still undetermined. Frentz looked at Sillin with a complicated expression, silently walked to the wall behind the chair, and pressed his palm on it. Where Frentz's palm touched, a flat surface that looked like an electronic board appeared. Frentz pressed a few numbers, but those numbers were definitely not passwords. Otherwise, he wouldn't have entered them in front of Sillin and the others. After entering, compared to a picture and some data from Zhang Kai, Frentz was stunned. Third generation. What? Falvey asked. He was very unhappy that a deal had turned out like this. His team members were still fighting the robots outside, and he didn't know what the situation was like. Frentz sighed. All the third-generation robots have betrayed us. Third-generation robots? Sillin and the others didn't know what Frentz meant by third-generation robots. Looking at the picture on the wall, a group of light dots surrounded the center. The one in the middle should be the castle, and those light dots were the third-generation robots that Frentz had mentioned. Frentz operated on the light wall for a while, then turned to look at Falvey. Have the people you brought here all entered the castle? Everyone is here except the people on the spaceplane. That's good. The castle will be sealed. The traitors have surrounded us. Falvey turned around and walked outside without saying a word. Since the castle was sealed, then the traitors inside the castle must be eliminated. The knights and servants inside the castle had already rebelled, and the original guard roles had been changed. The bloodstains on the ground belonged to the 3rd squad and the 6th squad. These robots didn't have blood. Therefore, Falvey and Schotten felt their hearts heavy when they saw the bloodstains on the ground. Regardless of whether their lives were in danger or not, a lot of blood had been lost. Perhaps Frentz had activated the castle's defense system, but the rebellious robots were attacked from all directions. They had nowhere to hide inside the castle, and of course they wouldn't hide. Very soon, the rebellious robots were cleaned up, and the medics were treating the wounded. 2/3 B squadron members were dead, and many were heavily injured. Fortunately, there were a lot of good medicine and medical equipment inside the castle, so the heavily injured were treated in time. But right now both Schotten and Falvey were in a pretty bad mood. They were trapped inside the castle, and they had no idea how the spaceplane was doing. They couldn't get in touch with it at all, and their communicators couldn't receive any signal at all. Therefore, Falvey went to Frentz and used his communicator to contact the people on the spaceplane. Fortunately, the spaceplane didn't seem to be under attack. Right now, the people inside were still wondering why they had suddenly lost contact. Before this, Sillin had only told them to be on high alert, but he didn't tell them to leave the castle in case they needed the spaceplane urgently. But right now they really didn't need it. Therefore, Falvey and Schotten ordered the people inside the spaceplane to leave the planet and rendezvous with the starship. They would contact each other when the time came. Although Falvey and Schotten really wanted to leave this place on the spaceplane, the spaceplane would definitely be shot down before it could even get close to the castle. Third-generation robots didn't just travel on the road. Before the arrival of the 3rd and 6th Division, Frentz was the only one in the castle. The other members of the Robert family, Frentz's wife and children were all on the other side of the planet. This was equivalent to Frentz's place of work. After the incident here, Frentz contacted the people on the other side of the planet and activated the highest level of defense. There weren't many third-generation robots on the other side. 80% of the Robert family on the planet were there, and with another layer of protection, Frentz wasn't worried about the situation there. Send the signal. Frentz, who was lying on the chair, said softly. A signal was sent from the castle and covered the entire planet. All the 4th generation and 5th generation robots that received this signal began to change. Their previous roles were no longer needed. The people in the villages and towns that Sillin and the others had seen, regardless of whether they were men or women, old or young, immediately changed their status. After a while, Franz finally left his study and came to the hall. After all, as the host, he had to explain something to the guests. He drew on the wall with his finger, and the wall turned into an electronic screen, showing the situation outside. The third-generation robots have all been infected with the virus. Now, I've named this virus Rebellion. All robots infected with this virus will no longer be controlled by the original core program, and will instead execute the program of the virus, which is what you've just encountered. But the strange thing is that the fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots are all normal. This virus can obviously infect the fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots, but in reality, it's not like that. In other words, this behavior has a purpose. Azrael. Schotten asked. Franz nodded. It should be. The Robert family wouldn't do such a thing. Sillin also said that he received an electromagnetic wave signal from Azrael. He didn't ask why Sillin was sure that he received the electromagnetic wave signal from Azrael. Nor did he ask why Sillin knew that the robots would rebel. Franz didn't have time to worry about these things now. Looking at the image displayed on the wall, Falvey frowned and said, if the fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots you're talking about are the civilian-looking robots we've seen, even though they have the advantage in numbers, it seems that they can't completely withstand the third-generation robots. After a pause, Falvey said, since there are third-generation and fourth-generation robots, then are there first- and second-generation robots? Franz didn't answer this question. He just looked at the image displayed on the screen. Outside the castle, the fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots were fighting against the third-generation robots. Whether it was in terms of material or equipment, they weren't as good as the third-generation robots. However, their suicidal attacks were a huge obstacle to the third-generation robots. In the image, a child, with only half a body left, grabbed a third-generation robot and self-destructed. Such a close-range explosion was indeed a great threat to the third-generation robots. However, looking at the scene of the explosion, everyone felt a strange sense of depression in their hearts. Even though they knew that it wasn't a human, they couldn't help but feel that it was unavoidable. Many people looked at the image on the wall, but Sillin only looked at it for a moment, and then stopped paying attention. Although his eyes were still on the screen, his thoughts were no longer on it. The robots gossiping earlier was actually to figure out if these people could understand the meaning of their communication. Whis didn't act like it understood what they were saying, so everything happened very quickly. But right now Sillin was puzzled as to why the robots chose this time to talk to him. In other words, why would Azrael choose this time to make the third-generation robots betray him? Franz definitely didn't know about this. Sillin could see that he wasn't lying. So what was Azrael's purpose this time? He definitely didn't want to kill Franz. Otherwise, the robots wouldn't have stopped Sillin from going to the study. The reason was because they didn't really want Franz to die. After thinking about it, Sillin speculated that Azrael's purpose was still on Franz. However, he didn't know how exactly Franz would react. The fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots became fewer and fewer. In the end, many fourth- and fifth-generation robots were destroyed by the powerful firepower, before they could even get close to the third-generation robots. The guns on the fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots could only make a small hole, or dent in the third-generation robots' bodies. Anyone with a discerning eye could see the difference, and they also expected this result. What should we do? Falvey looked at the screen and said. This question was asked by Franz, and no one else said anything. Carey rubbed his shoulder cannon, and Chiefing was playing with his fingers. He probably hadn't killed enough. Xueqiu was very quiet, sleeping next to Tang Qiuqiu. However, if one looked into its eyes, they would know that this white fatty had been playing, very happily. More and more third-generation robots had gathered around the castle. The third and sixth team didn't have the patience to calm down. They didn't know how long the castle could last, and they were prepared for the robots outside to break in. Franz rubbed his eyebrows and said helplessly, "Hey, activate the second-generation activation wave signal." Second-generation activation? Second-generation robots? What did the second-generation robots look like? The screen showed an image of another part of the planet. It was a mountainous area with many tall mountains. However, gradually, everyone was shocked. One of the mountains began to change, breaking down into small pieces, and each piece turned into a human shape. That was the second-generation robot. It was as big as a mountain, and the broken pieces were densely packed on the ground. It was much smaller than the third-generation robot, but it was still the second-generation robot, so it should be more powerful. It should have no problem taking down the third-generation robot. However, it didn't take long for Frenz to scream. Impossible. Looking at the image on the screen, Huimao, who was lying on Silen's shoulder, shook his beard. I think we fell into a trap. Chapter 187. The image on the screen sent chills down everyone's spines. The second-generation robots that had just been awakened from the decomposition of a mountain had all stiffened up before the third-generation robot's betrayal could be resolved. The so-called stiffening meant that the robots were frozen in place, and the only things that flashed through their eyes were some fluorescent red things. The fluorescent red things were caused by the virus invasion, and the flashing red things in the robots' eyes were a sign that their programs were being modified. Frenz's control was growing weaker and weaker, and although Frenz tried his best to salvage the situation, he still couldn't stop the virus from invading. The invasion of these rebellious programs was tyrannical. Some of the second-generation robots' tools and control programs couldn't be completely changed, and some of the encrypted microsystems couldn't be completely infiltrated either. Compared to the third-generation robots, the rebellious virus obviously took longer to infect the second-generation robots, and some of the programs that couldn't be changed were forcibly erased. Therefore, when the second-generation robot's stiffening was over, their movements didn't look as smooth as before. It looks like the virus didn't completely infect the second-generation robots, Schotten said. Falvey and the others let out a small sigh of relief. At least they could handle the third-generation robots for a while, but the second generation was troublesome. 5 third-generation robots might not even be able to handle one second-generation robot. No, it's not over yet. Frenz's finger swiftly tapped on the hologram. Yudi, Beaver and the others were slowly noticing something. They're improving it, Yudi said. Frenz didn't answer. It was obvious that he agreed with Yudi's words. Does this mean that someone on this planet is improving these virus programs? Falvey asked. A member of the 3rd B Squadron nodded. It should be. Otherwise, these rebellious viruses wouldn't have invaded with such purpose and improved so quickly. The person who spread the virus, Azrael, was on this planet. The third-generation robots' movements were gradually becoming smoother, which meant that the virus had spread to a wider area. The more unified the robot's command program was, the faster its movements were. Therefore, for Frenz and the other party behind the scenes, when there were 2 different commands, the robot's reaction would definitely be slower. However, as Frenz's control over the third-generation robot weakened, the third-generation robot's movements became smoother and smoother. The situation was not optimistic. If it was only the third generation, they could just rush out and fight. However, with the addition of the second generation, rushing out rashly would definitely be courting death. When Silen saw that Frenz didn't even bother to wipe the sweat off his forehead, his hands didn't stop moving, and he didn't even dare to slow down his speed, he said, "If you can't do it alone, then send a couple of people to do it. We do have some technicians in our B squadrons who know about this." Schotten and Falvey looked at each other and then at Frenz, who did not say anything. They frowned and shook their heads. The Robert family's robots had their own special control methods and special coding programs that could not be leaked to the outside world. For example, Frenz was typing the program right in front of them, but not a single person could understand it. It was because Frenz was typing some special symbols, and every symbol represented a different meaning. Moreover, as a famous robot family in the League of Stars, the Robert family had their own special programming language. Unlike the common programming language used in the League of Stars, only members of the Robert family could understand this programming language. Other than that, they also had their own proprietary formulas and commands. If the technicians of the 2 squadrons joined the fray, then Frenz would have to reveal these things to them. Otherwise, there was no way the technicians of the 2 squadrons could do it. Bang! Frenz hammered the wall with all his strength. The complex data and symbols displayed on the holographic screen were incomprehensible. Even though they did not understand what these symbols represented, they could see the smooth movements of the second-generation robots and the speed of the third-generation robots. Fritz's clenched fists smashing into the wall told them that the virus had completely infiltrated the second-generation robots. But what they didn't know was that the reason Fritz was so angry wasn't because the second-generation robots had all been invaded by the virus. It was because he had found a way to invade the second and third-generation robots so quickly. A gap that had always been overlooked. The reason the Robert family's robots could be so close to humans and possess the supercomputing power and strength of robots was because of the liquid brain. The liquid brain core was different from other machines that had a solid core chip. The chips in the brains of robots were liquid and wrapped in a brain core. Compared to solid chips, they could be more flexible, had a stronger ability to upgrade, and were much more compatible than the former. This time, the rebel virus worked on the nanowires on the outer shell of the brain. It couldn't invade the brain, but after acting on the nanowires, it cut off the line between the liquid core inside the brain and the external execution circuit, allowing the external execution circuit to transmit the commands spread by the virus. Now the robots that were invaded by the virus, whether it was the third generation or the second generation, didn't have the supercomputing function and divergent branching program. They were just weapons, and the hit rate was significantly lower than before. This was good news. But for Fritz, this was undoubtedly a fiery slap in the face. The nanowires and other microfibers attached to the outside of the brain were directly cut off. Although they had thought about this before, many people in the family thought it was impossible. After all, the microfibers and nanowires must all be cut off in order to block the connection between the brain and the external execution circuit. At that time, most people thought it was impossible, so they didn't delve into this aspect. Every time the robots were upgraded, they improved other aspects. However, Fritz wasn't one of those people. Although the robots were later produced according to the family's standards, the robots that Fritz was most proud of weren't designed according to the family's standards. Fritz had put a lot of effort into the brain. He even added layers of encryption to the terminals of the microfibers and nanowires. Because the project was too difficult, he only used this method once. The robots that came after that were similar to the common robots in the family, which were the second, third, and fourth generation robots. As for the first generation, they were the ones that Fritz put the most effort into. However, Fritz wasn't willing to use them. If he used them, this city would be ruined, and all these years of operation would be wasted. While thinking about this, Fritz slammed his fists against the wall again. Sillin felt that the people of the Robert family had a kind of obsession. It was as if they knew it was a lie, but they still forced themselves to believe it. They had the capital to be arrogant, but if they were too arrogant and overconfident, they would neglect many things. Forget it, Sillin was too lazy to talk about other people's business. Flicking Huimao's ear, Sillin asked, "How is it?" Huimao gave him a confident look. Sillin smiled slightly. In terms of machinery, there were many more people in the League of Stars who were better than the Robert family. It was just that the halo of the Robert family was too dazzling, and it overshadowed the shining points of others. The unfamiliar symbols of Fritz had already been deciphered by Huimao, and he had also learned some information about the brain nucleus. The two teams in the hall were a little anxious as more and more robots gathered outside. They kept hearing the sounds of explosions outside, which meant that the robots outside were firing at them. Right now, it was only the third-generation robots. When the second-generation robots arrived, they didn't know if this ancient castle would be able to withstand them. Falvey was very angry. Their contract didn't say that they had to protect the buyer. However, the problem was that their current transaction hadn't been completed. Although the price had been negotiated and the goods had been inspected, they hadn't received the money yet. It seemed that Fritz wouldn't give them the money for the time being. This was a disaster that they had been implicated in. Since the goods had already been handed over, they had to hand over the money and the goods, and Fritz didn't seem to want their help. Hence, Falvey directly explained to Fritz that this was Fritz's own matter, and that the two teams were purely implicated. They would leave after getting the money, and they could do whatever they wanted. Falvey and Schotten weren't stupid. They knew that Frantz definitely had his own trump card. Since he had a trump card, why would he want the two teams to pay with their lives for the robots here? Although it would be difficult to rush out, it would be even more difficult if they waited for the second-generation robots to arrive. It would be better to leave now and fly away from the planet. However, what surprised Falvey was that Frantz hoped that they could stay, and was willing to pay double the price of the T-13 mine. However, no matter how much money it was, they had to be alive to spend it. When they had come here, due to some of the rules that Frantz had set, they had only brought some simple weapons. It would be very difficult to fight against those inhuman beings. Just by looking at the ratio of numbers, they knew that they were at a complete disadvantage. 2 hours. Just 2 hours. In 2 hours, I will work with the other side of the planet to find a way to kill the virus. If we still can't find it by then, I will activate the first generation to fight. And then the first generation will follow in the footsteps of the second generation? Falvey said with some mockery. No, the first generation is different from the other generations. It is my proudest work, and it won't be infected by the virus, Frantz said with certainty. Falvey looked at Schotten. Schotten was a little suspicious. Were the Robert family people so blindly confident? The defense of the castle is now completely capable of resisting the attacks of the second and third generation robots. It might not be able to last forever, but it should be able to last for 2 hours. Schotten and Falvey felt that these words had some credibility. The outer layer of the castle was protected by an energy shield, and the walls of the castle, whether it was the outer layer or the inner hall, were rather sturdy. Even Carl couldn't break through. To be honest, in terms of safety, both Schotten and Falvey knew that it was a good opportunity to leave now. If they stayed, things might very well get out of control. On the other hand, if they rejected Frantz now, it might not take long for the news that the Vanguard was afraid of Azrael and the Robert family's robots to spread. Fuck, what the hell? After discussing with Schotten, Falvey accepted Frantz's proposal. At the same time, they signed a new contract. After that, both sides felt much more at ease. Frantz returned to his study to work. Schotten and Falvey also stayed in Frantz's study. What if this guy changed his mind and ran away? Frantz didn't reject Schotten and Falvey's request to stay in the study. He believed that with Schotten and Falvey's intellect and level of education, they wouldn't be able to understand the Robert family's exclusive programming language. If Falvey and Schotten heard Frantz's evaluation of them in his mind, they might just pull out their guns and shoot him. In the hall, both teams stayed there. Some of them wandered around the castle, since there were no robots to restrain them, and Frantz didn't say that they weren't allowed to wander around. Those who had nothing better to do would also wander around. It was rare to see such a castle-like building. Fuck, the doors are all closed. I thought I'd see something special, Carrie said after walking around. We can't help it. This is the Robert family's territory. Although it's a castle-like building, it's still the work of the Mech family. Otherwise, why would Frantz let us stay here? Yudi sneered. And don't forget, those gun barrels that popped out from all over the walls that killed the robots in the ancient castle. This ancient castle is Frantz's eyes, Beaver added. Qifeng and Tang Qiuqiu weren't in the mood to talk about this. Xueqiu pulled Tang Qiuqiu over and told her about their great achievements. Qifeng, on the other hand, was playing with his claws. Yudo's curiously moved closer to have a look. How did those claws tear the robots in half? Hey Sillin, what are you thinking about? Carrie elbowed Sillin. Sillin and Huimao had been silent since the beginning. Huimao was lying on Sillin's shoulder with his eyes closed. It looked like he was asleep, but Sillin knew that he was processing the new electromagnetic waves and the signals transmitted by Frantz. The entire castle revealed a lot of information. Others might not know anything, but for Huimao, who had cracked the Robert family's exclusive programming language, the amount of information was huge. As for Sillin, his understanding of the machine language wasn't as good as Huimao, so he didn't dwell on this problem. Instead, he was analyzing something else. Hearing Carrie's question, Sillin raised his head and looked at Carrie and the others. Did you notice that the buildings in the villages and towns we passed before, whether they were tall or short, luxurious or plain, although some of them were destroyed, most of them were still intact? Even during the battle between the fourth and fifth generation robots and the second generation robots, those buildings were still intact. They were almost the same as the castle we are staying in now. Silen's words caused Carrie to recall for a moment. He stared at the display screen on the wall of the hall, and noticed that it was showing images of several places from different angles. Most of them were the areas around the ancient castle, but there were some buildings that weren't damaged at all. The third-generation robots had been smashing their way through the buildings, but that was all they could see. Indeed. How long will it take for the second generation to arrive here? Silen asked Beaver. Beaver and Yudi took out some small instruments and calculated. The fastest part will arrive in 10 minutes. Beaver pointed at the flying robot birds on the panel. These were the fastest ones. The others won't take long. After the vanguard arrives, they will arrive one after another. Silen nodded. What else do you know? Beaver's face was bitter. It's blocked. This castle has blocked all external signals from the outside and inside. Only Frunze's own signal can enter and receive it, Yudi said as he pushed the Miantuan's tail away from his arm. Silen grunted and closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair without saying a word. Hey, you brat, don't tell me you're going to sleep in this situation? Carrie cried out. Silen didn't open his eyes. There's nothing I can do even with my eyes open. I might as well take a good rest. Who knows, there might be a tough battle later. Carrie opened his mouth but didn't say anything. He continued to look at Yudi and Beaver's statistics. Silen closed his eyes. The signals around him appeared in his mind. He could even recognize the unfamiliar symbols, but he didn't know what they meant. He would probably need Huimao to translate when the time came. 10 minutes later, the second generation's first batch of robots arrived. It was obvious that the castle had suffered an even fiercer attack. Although the castle wasn't damaged, the vibrations caused by the energy shield affected the castle. Everyone in the hall was nervous because of the vibrations. They were afraid that the energy shield would collapse in the next moment. However, the good thing was that the energy shield lasted for 2 hours. Although it was showing signs of collapsing, it still made it through. The bad news was that Frunze and the other Robert family members on this planet didn't find a way to deal with the virus. The virus program was too tricky. The more Frunze learned about it, the more he knew how complicated and domineering it was. If all the robots self-destructed at the same time, the planet would really be destroyed. Frunze's decades of hard work would go down the drain. 2 hours later, the look in Frunze's eyes dimmed. According to what he said before, that was the only way. Frunze stood up from his chair and walked to the wall not far from the desk. Just like before, he raised his hand and placed it on the wall. A light screen and control panel appeared on the wall. He entered the symbols, scanned his identity, and verified his genes. After a series of tests, Frunze said, "First generation, activate." The first generation was the robot that Frunze had spent the most effort on. Unlike the second-generation robots that were placed in the mountains, they had always been with Frunze and the other Robert family members on this planet. Chapter 188. The first-generation robots were the first batch of robots that Frunze had created when he established his kingdom. Perhaps there were some new technologies that Frunze hadn't used, but in terms of complexity and superiority of materials, they were much better than the later generations. Previously, the third team and the sixth team didn't know where the so-called first generation was. The fourth and fifth generation were like commoners, living in this artificial city that Frunze had constructed. The third generation was like a guard stationed in this city. The second generation was like a recluse, and would only be awakened at certain critical times. What about the first generation? Everyone looked at the scene displayed on the wall. Apart from Silen, Yudi, and the others who had just discussed this matter and were prepared, everyone else had a look of astonishment on their faces. In this city, no, it wasn't just this city. There were many places on this planet where the Robert family existed. In the towns and cities that were built, every building that hadn't suffered any damage from the rebellion of the third and second generation robots was a first generation robot. Although this ancient castle hadn't changed much, everyone had already begun to guess whether this ancient castle was also a first generation robot. Were they currently in the stomach of a first-generation robot? In reality, the first-generation robots weren't like the other generations that had humanoid forms. Their shapes weren't necessarily the same, and their sizes were also different. However, they were very unique. They looked very rough, like ancient machines, and many of them were covered in a layer of sand, like a generation that had been eliminated by the passage of time. However, when the first generation and second generation clashed, it was clear who was superior and who was inferior. Their huge bodies, agile speed, and excellent equipment could be seen. From the energy shields that constantly flashed, and the form that constantly changed to adapt to the battlefield, it could be seen how much effort had been put into creating this first-generation robot. Huimao, who was lying on Silin's shoulder, had the fur on his ears constantly trembling. Outsiders wouldn't notice anything strange after all, who would stare at a cat's ears all the time. Even if they stared, they wouldn't have any other thoughts just because of the trembling of the cat's ears. Every single hair on Huimao's ears was tracking a wave signal. When Frunze activated the first generation, the wave signal suddenly increased. Not only did it come from the first generation, but there were also some signals coming from the outside. These signals carried information similar to the rebel virus. If the first generation received these signals, the virus would begin to infect the first generation. However, the good thing was that even if the first generation robots received these waves, they didn't have the same reaction as the second generation robots. They were still stubbornly clearing the second and third generation rebels. The shorter ones were 10 meters, and the taller ones were more than 100 meters. Seeing the first-generation robots send the third-generation robots flying as if they were ants, everyone had to admit that they were a lot calmer and calmer. With these first-generation robots, things should be easy, right? Someone said. No, it won't be that easy. Frentz, who had followed Shotun and Falvi to the hall, looked at the people in the hall and said, "The size of the first generation also has its weakness. They are not without blind spots. There are too many third-generation and second-generation robots out there. Compared to the numbers of those two, the first generation's numbers are only 1% of theirs, maybe even less." What do you mean? Falvi kind of understood what Frunze was going to say next. Previously, they had accepted the conditions to stay here for 2 hours and missed the best time to leave. That was already enough to make Falvi feel conflicted. Falvi didn't regret it, after all, he had a bunch of lives under his command. But now, from Frunze's tone, he wanted them to join in the fight against the robots. The battlefield outside belonged to the robots. Now that the two teams had joined forces, they were going to fight against the robots with their bodies? Were they looking for shit? Also, their weapons and equipment were far from the needs of the battlefield. If they had known that there would be a battle of this level, they would definitely have upgraded their equipment by a few levels. They wouldn't have only brought some cold weapons and simple firearms. Frunze gave Falvi a calm look. Take it out." As soon as Frunze's voice fell, rows of long boxes fell from the ceiling. The boxes opened, revealing the things inside. When he saw what was inside, Beaver's eyes lit up, and he almost drooled. Those who knew what was inside had the same expression as Beaver. If it were not for the situation forcing them to hold back, they would have pounced over a long time ago. Being able to see but not be able to touch was as uncomfortable as being scratched by a cat's paw. Half-biological mechanical weapons. Falvi raised his eyebrows and looked at Frunze, allowing him to continue. When he heard the words half-biological mechanical, Huimao's body stiffened. But as Beaver explained in a low voice, the vigilance in Huimao's eyes gradually faded, replaced by thick disdain. How could this broken thing be called a biological mechanical? An authentic half-mechanical life form, a rare species in the universe, was here, and this old man still had the nerve to show it off. However, the others didn't know this. Frunze also didn't know that there was an authentic half-mechanical life form here. After all, the Robert family's half-biological mechanical life form was modeled after Huimao's half-mechanical life form. In order to make it more portable, they had changed a lot, and according to different needs, they could make it into different shapes and have different functions. Frunze went on with his speech. He hoped that the third team and the sixth team could go out and share some of the burden with Gen 3. That was because Gen 3's main target was Gen 2, and Gen 3's threat was at the back. Half-biological mechanical weapons were quite expensive, and they weren't common among hunter groups. Only a small number of hunters had them, and most of them weren't the best ones. The military used more humans, which was why many hunters were jealous of the military. According to Frunze, not only would he provide these high-end weapons for the two teams to use, but he would also choose to give some of them to the two teams after this incident. The core unlock code in these weapons hasn't been unlocked yet. I've set it up so that it can only be used for 72 hours. After this incident is over, I will unlock the core unlock code and let them officially change owners. I will also pay you a sum of money, still the same amount. How about it? Frunze looked at Falvi and Schotten. Some of them were already swallowing their saliva, looking at their team leader eagerly. It had to be said that Frunze understood the psychology of hunters very well. He knew what kind of hunter needed in a certain situation. As a hunter from one of the 4 major hunter groups, even if they weren't from the main team, no one would back down, let alone in this kind of situation. Most of the people that Schotten and Falvi brought with them were combatants. Combatants always had the desire to fight, and as Frunze threw out tempting conditions, some of them finally couldn't resist anymore. Go team leader. We have to avenge our dead teammates. Whether it was for their dead teammates for their desire to fight, or for the half-biological mechanical weapons provided by Frunze, Falvi remained silent. He was still weighing the pros and cons Schotten discussed with the rest of the team and looked at Sillin. What do you think, Sillin? Sillin thinks for a moment and said, the purpose of Azrael's people should be the robots. They probably won't do anything to us. Mr. Frunze provided the weapons and protective equipment. If it's just to help the first generation, it's fine. However, I still have some questions for Mr. Frunze. Schotten nodded. Mr. Frunze, my teammates want to ask you something. Frunze knew Sillin. If it weren't for Sillin, he would have been killed by the servant. Although the Robert family always thought highly of themselves, Frunze's tone was not bad in front of Sillin. If you have any questions, just ask. Mr. Frunze, what I want to ask is, other than these weapons, should you provide anything else? Anything else? For example. Frunze looked at Sillin in confusion. For example, fighter jets, armored vehicles or aircrafts. Oh that. Frunze sat on the chair and unconsciously tapped his finger on the wall. The Robert family is famous for manufacturing robots. As for fighter jets, armored vehicles, or aircrafts, we don't use them often. However, I do have some here. Frunze's finger slid on the wall, and a light screen appeared on the wall. After clicking on it, some images appeared. That's all I have here. The others are further away from here, on the other side of the planet. In the picture, there were small fighter jets with a strange shape. They were flat, and the armored vehicles were still alright. As for the aircrafts, the big ones were too big, and the small ones were too small. However, if they were to use the small aircrafts and move in batches, they would still make do. It was better than nothing. How could human strength compare to those tireless machines? With these things, it was obvious that the people in the team were more inclined towards Frunze's suggestion. Falvi couldn't reject the hot, expectant gazes of the others, and the main reason was that he was also inclined towards this deal. In fact, Falvi and Schotten both knew that this was a win-win deal. This was a win-win deal. The two teams needed new weapons, and Frunze needed people to test them on the real battlefield. After signing the contract, everyone rushed over to take one out and started fiddling with it. This thing is known as a luxury item worth tens of millions. Carrie carefully rubbed the arm cover in his hand. Although these could be sold for tens of millions in some places, it was much cheaper in terms of cost. So Frunze didn't feel bad about giving them away. To people like him, the most important thing was the improvement of technology, not the obsession with money. Sillin also took an arm cover and put it on. The moment the arm cover was put on, Sillin felt the arm cover fit well with his arm. Although it wasn't 100% fit, it was at least 80%. Using the weapons on the arm holster was as easy as moving a finger. Sillin gave it a try and looked at the weapons that were equipped on the arm holster. There were cold weapons, sharp knives that looked like wrist blades, ropes, extremely thin filaments that could hold a lot of weight, and there were also weapons that could fire. The arm cover itself was also an extremely high level of protection. Sillin brought over an armor-like thing and put it on Tang Qiuqiu. After all, Tang Qiuqiu's physical fitness was not as good as the others. This protective armor was very light and could move with the body's movements. Its defense was also very good, and it could better protect Tang Qiuqiu. Qifeng fiddled with the arm cover that was similar to the one Sillin had. He felt very uncomfortable wearing it, so he took it off and threw it aside, no longer paying attention to it. Sillin didn't force him. After all, Qifeng was indeed different from the others. Frunze also provided a batch of slightly more powerful firearms. Everyone chose them according to their preferences and needs. However, the aircraft that Frunze had selected was a mini-model. Schotten looked at it and discussed with Falvi. Each team would have one aircraft or armored vehicle, and they would move according to the team's needs and keep in touch. Sillin chose the aircraft, and he planned to start from the periphery. Once the teams were ready, they began to move. People like Yudos, who were more inclined towards aircraft, chose to fly the aircraft directly. The aircraft was very small, and it could only accommodate one person. Also, it was not suitable for tall and strong people. Yudos, on the other hand, was just right. After sitting in it, just looking at the control panel made Yudo's blood boil, and he was eager to try it out. Yudo's aircraft flew together with Sillin's aircraft, and he took care of some second-generation flying machines in the air. The second-generation machines were very agile, and they were very fast. If one was not careful, they could easily be shot down. However, as Yudos gradually familiarized himself with the operation of the aircraft, he became more and more adept at it. He could even perform a few super maneuvers. Sillin and his team flew to the periphery from a high altitude. They didn't encounter many second-generation mechanical birds, and it didn't take long for them to arrive at their original destination. There were some fourth-generation and fifth-generation robots fighting with the third-generation robots there. The second-generation robots were mainly heading toward the city. Because there weren't many second-generation robots, they didn't see any first-generation ones either. The prey here is all ours. Carrie looked at the arm holster on his arm, playing with his gun, and said, "When we get there, everyone pay attention. Don't act alone, at least in groups of 2, so that you don't know when you're surrounded," Sillin emphasized. "Qiuqiu, you stay by Qiuqiu's side and cover him. Qifeng, you follow me." Sillin pointed at Qiuqiu and Qifeng. As for the others, they had already made their own choices. After contacting Yudos on the aircraft, Sillin waved his hand. "Begin." Because the first-generation robots had all left, the remaining villages were in ruins. Collapsed houses were everywhere, and bullet holes and tangent lines from laser weapons were everywhere. It could be seen that the planet was still in the process of being modified. Otherwise, the land would have been mechanized like the city. Tang Qiuqiu stayed at a sniping point, and was in charge of sniping. Qiuqiu was around Tang Qiuqiu, killing the robots that got close. Carrie, Beaver, and Yudi had already rushed up to kill. The 3 of them worked well together, and Tico and Lycrabe also worked well together. Yudos in the air was getting more and more aggressive, challenging the robots' lock-on skills at every moment. Other than the 2 little fellows, Scarlet Wind and Tang Qiuqiu, Sillin didn't have to worry about anyone else in the team. Bang! Sillin sent a second-gen robot flying with a single punch, but he only managed to leave a shallow dent on its body. Unlike the third-gen robot that was directly smashed into smithereens, the second-gen robot that was sent flying quickly climbed back to its feet and aimed its light tube at Sillin. Sillin dodged it, and just as the robot was about to fire at Sillin, Qifeng pounced on the robot from behind. When the robot turned its head, Qifeng's claws stabbed into the robot's eyes. After twisting a few times, the robot's movements became sluggish, as if there was a programming error. It was only after Sillin added another stab that the robot finally stopped. Dragging it to a hidden place, Sillin used the particle cutter to cut open the robot's head, revealing the thing inside. On the robot's head, there was a hard object the size of a peanut. This hard object had a lot of fibrous wires around it, which were equivalent to human nerves, But the wires of the robot were not as fragile as human nerves. Even if these wires were cut, the robot's movements wouldn't be affected too much. Just now, when Qifeng used his claws to stir, he cut more than half of the wires around the peanut-sized object, which slowed down the robot's reaction. These wires that were connected to that hard thing were nanowires and other microfibers. And that hard thing was the liquid core nuclear brain specially made by the Robert family. Since the peanut-sized object wasn't damaged, it proved that the liquid core nuclear brain inside was still intact. Sillin took out an alloy knife and cut it. This special alloy knife didn't cut the hard shell in one go, and it took several cuts before it made a small opening. Crack! The hard shell that was wrapped around the liquid core nuclear brain broke, and a liquid that looked like mercury flowed out. This was the real liquid core nuclear brain. Sillin looked at this liquid, and there was a moment of absent-mindedness. It was as if he had returned to the experiment platform, and the tube of liquid that was injected. Wasn't it similar to this liquid core? Could it be that crazy Hole was a member of the Robert family? That couldn't be right. Later on, Sillin also looked up information about Hole, and the Robert family didn't have a person like Hole. After all, the Robert family didn't have a genotype as low as Hole's, and Sillin, who had come into contact with friends, knew that the two of them didn't have any similarities in their DNA and genetic information. The liquid core technology was invented by the Robert family hundreds of years ago, and there were no relevant reports in the League of Stars about people outside of the Robert family researching a new liquid core. What they researched was an outdated product that the Robert family had researched a long time ago. In that case, did Hole imitate the Robert family's liquid core technology to invent the improved liquid core? Huimao moved closer to the pool of liquid and sniffed it. He even licked it. It wasn't bad as food. After the novelty wore off, he didn't think much of it. Seeing that Sillin kept staring at the pool of liquid without saying anything, Huimao raised his paw and waved it in front of Sillin. "What's wrong?" Sillin shook his head. "Nothing." After a pause he said, "If I can get a good brain core like this one." Sillin pointed at the peanut-sized object. "Get as many as you can. I have a use for them." Qifeng didn't have any objections to this. It was easy for him to get this. All he had to do was reach into the brains of those robots and stir it around. Chapter 189. Somewhere on the planet, on top of a mountain peak, a man was sitting and fiddling with an instrument in front of him. He looked very young, very ordinary, and completely transparent in a crowd of people. The image of the instrument showed the battle scenes of the main places on the planet, and the one with the most images was the town where Sillin and the others were at. A second-generation mechanical bird flew over, placed 2 liquid core brains the size of chicken eggs on its claw in front of the young man, and then flew away again. This second-generation mechanical bird had put down the liquid core brains of 2 first-generation machines, and they were perfectly intact. Of course, it wasn't that easy to destroy a first-generation liquid core brain. After all, the outer shell of a liquid core brain was one of the sturdiest parts of a machine. The young man moved his gaze away from the instrument and looked at the 2 liquid core brains on the ground. He picked them up and examined them carefully, and then put them into a small specially prepared box. After fiddling with the instrument for a while, the young man closed the instrument and stretched his waist. "That's it, I'm leaving." "Why didn't you infect the 4th and 5th generations and be done with it?" Someone sitting not far behind the young man asked. "There's no need for that. Just treat it as an act of leniency for this incident," the person who was packing up the instrument said in a compassionate tone. The person behind the young man curled his lips and interpreted the expression on his face as, "I'll be a fool if I believe you. Leniency my ass." After packing up the instrument, the duo boarded a spaceplane not far away from them and left. On the other side, the 3rd B Squadron and the 6th Division were assisting the first generation in fighting against the rebels. Small squads like Sillin's on the periphery were doing fine. Overall, with the high-level equipment provided by friends, no one died for the time being. As long as the injuries weren't too serious, they could stay on the battlefield and continue fighting. In reality, Huimao really wanted to transform, but he didn't want to be discovered by friends, so he temporarily suppressed his thoughts. That being said, this cat form was more than enough to fight against the third-generation robots. He could easily tear through the outer shell with a single claw. The second generation was slightly more troublesome, but not too much of a threat. Plus, there weren't many second-generation robots here. Sillin was using both a sword and a gun at the same time. The light bullets formed by the energy gun looked like exploding fireworks due to Sillin's nearly seamless shooting. Moreover, Sillin didn't just stay in one spot. His figure weaved through the robots, and the light blade in his other hand made continuous hissing noises as it cut through the mechanical bodies. Not far from Sillin, of course, Chiefing used claw after claw to fish out the liquid core brains that Sillin destroyed. If there were robots that came, Chiefing would mercilessly eliminate them. He had the ability to deal with the third-generation robots, and Chiefing's usual method was to tear them apart. As they fought, Sillin found that the reaction of these robots was getting slower and slower. The person controlling the virus has left, and Friends has been taking action. He's slowly taking back control of these robots, Huimao said. This was all analyzed from the received signals. Huimao was more and more impressed with his ability to analyze things. He was really an irreplaceable and incomparable existence. Indeed, as Huimao said, it didn't take long for the third-generation robots to suddenly go from young to old. Everyone also realized that things had changed. Shotten's voice came from the communicator hanging on his ear, explaining the reason for this situation. It was similar to what Huimao said. When the third-generation and second-generation robots stopped moving, everyone followed Shotten's instructions and stopped what they were doing. However, they didn't let down their guard. 5 minutes later, all the robots were sorted and lined up. Friends officially announced that he had taken back control of these robots. Huimao, who was squatting on Sillin's shoulder, snorted. Those who don't know better would think that Friends did something big. If the other party didn't take the initiative to leave, with the ability of Friends and his people, how could they have taken back control so easily? Meow, I despise you. Sillin flicked Huimao's ear with his finger. Don't say this in front of Friends. We still need to get some benefits from him. Hearing that they wanted to get benefits, Huimao immediately shut his mouth, but his tail was full of energy and he was very proud. When Sillin and the others returned, Friends was already waiting in front of the castle. As for the castle from before, it had already changed its form into that of a robot. It stretched out its arms to encircle Friends and the others, separating them from the second and third generation robots that were lined up outside to prevent any accidents. Sillin walked into the circled area. Huimao didn't follow Sillin, and Sillin didn't force him. As for the reason for this incident, the two captains didn't ask too much. The mission had been completed, and it was time to fulfill Friends' promise. Friends was quite straightforward. He handed the things that he had prepared long ago to Falvey and Schotten. In fact, he also knew that the two teams had collected some liquid brain cores, but Friends didn't care. Some of this technology was only known to the Robert family, and he was confident that even if the people from Vanguard got their hands on the liquid brain cores, they wouldn't be able to get any results. At most, they would just copy a low-quality product, just like the other people who peeped at the Robert family's technology. Besides, although the Robert family's robots were expensive to sell, there were still a lot of them in various places in the League of Stars. Those people had taken out the liquid brain cores for research, but they still hadn't been able to get any results. Friends was now concerned about avoiding the invasion of similar viruses. After this incident, he would connect all the robots on this planet in the same way as the first generation's nuclear brain cores. He would also inform his family about this incident. He believed that after this incident, Friends' position in the family would rise to another level. If something similar happened on other planets, they would definitely be wiped out. Friends indeed had the right to be arrogant. However, when it came to arrogant people like Friends, Schotten and Falvey didn't have the patience to keep chatting with them. If Friends looked down on them, they would look down on Friends too. After receiving the payment and counting, they decisively retreated. The starship outside the planet had been trying to contact the people on the planet, but after Azrael's people left, it was quickly connected. Now an aircraft had been sent to the planet to take them back. Sillin noticed that there was something wrong with the cat when Huimao jumped on his shoulder. However, Sillin didn't ask. He just pretended not to know. After returning to the starship, the injured people were immediately treated. This showed the benefits of having Lycrabe and Tico on board. The improvement of the drug formula, as well as the surgery and treatment methods, were all carried out quite smoothly and efficiently. Regarding this incident, the third team and the sixth team were much more familiar with each other. After all, they had fought together on the battlefield. They had gone through thick and thin together, so they didn't have any objections to the distribution of the loot. They even got together for a drink. After the successful celebration of this incident, everyone returned to their respective teams to rest. Qifeng had been forced to drink a lot by Carrie, and was now sleeping soundly. Sillin was also getting ready to sleep, but Huimao jumped onto the bed and paced back and forth on the edge of the bed. He curled his tail irritably, pulled his ears back, and scratched the bed with his claws from time to time. Sillin turned sideways and looked at Huimao, who was about to raise his claws to slap him. "I say, Master Cat, are you feeling angry?" Huimao's whiskers trembled. He opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. He raised his claws and pressed them on Sillin's nose. "I'll press, press, and press again." Sillin pushed away the cat's claws and lifted Huimao up. "I'll give you 2 minutes to prepare. If you have something to say, just say it. Don't hold it in for a few days and not be able to poop." Huimao flicked his ears. "I don't need to poop." Then there was silence. 1 minute, Sillin reminded. Otherwise, this stupid cat would be in a daze until Qifeng woke up. Tsk, it was so stupid. It didn't know how to lie and couldn't even hide its thoughts. How could there be such a stupid mechanical life form? Licking his nose, Huimao looked at Sillin and spat out something the size of an egg. This was the liquid core nuclear brain in the head of the first-generation robot under Friends. Sillin picked it up and looked at it. This nuclear brain was slightly bigger than the second-generation robot, and from the looks of it, its hardness was not something the second-generation robot's nuclear brain shell could compare to. Sillin looked at Huimao. "When did you kill a first-generation robot?" When Huimao heard this, he immediately exploded. "I wasn't the one who beat it up like that." At that time, Huimao did not follow Sillin into the circled area. Instead, he took a stroll outside. Later, he saw some big guys lying on the ground in a mess. Some were beaten beyond recognition, and some had their heads completely blown off. Thinking that Sillin needed those nuclear brains, Huimao jumped over to look, but he found that the nuclear brains were all gone. At the same time, he saw a different type of small machine taking the liquid core nuclear brain out of a first-generation robot's smashed head and taking it away. They were heading in the direction of the ancient castle. It seemed that Friends also paid a lot of attention to these first-generation nuclear brains. This made Whis even more curious. After searching for a while, it finally found a first-generation robot whose head hadn't been smashed to smithereens, but whose upper body had been destroyed beyond recognition. Then, it dug out the liquid core inside the first-generation robot's brain and swallowed it whole. The liquid core nuclear brain was in Huimao's stomach. As long as Huimao was not willing to reveal any information, the scanners would not be able to find anything. Therefore, when looking for the 3 missing first-generation nuclear brains, Friends did not find anything in Team 3 and 6 team. He also did not find anything after searching the entire world. Friends attributed the disappearance of the 3 first-generation nuclear brains to Azrael's actions. This was because in the memory area of a second-generation robot's liquid core nuclear brain, there was an image of the person who transported the first-generation nuclear brain to Azrael. Huimao originally wanted Sillin to take the initiative to ask, because he felt that nothing could be hidden from Sillin. However, the reality was that Sillin always pretended not to know and did not ask, so he held back and did not say anything. It was really embarrassing for a rare cyborg life form in the universe to act like this. Huimao really could not hold it in anymore. Seeing that Sillin was about to sleep, the string in his brain snapped, and he jumped over to give him a claw. In the end, he was stopped by Sillin's eyes. After the gray cat spilled everything out like beans, Sillin fell silent for a few seconds. Then he stretched out his hand and rubbed the gray cat's head for a while. It was only when the gray cat's fur was about to explode that he stopped. He stored the first-generation liquid core brain into the leaf pattern ring and patted the cat's head. Go to sleep, we'll have an extra meal tomorrow. Huimao, who was about to ask something, immediately kicked the question he was about to ask out of his head. I want to eat fish biscuits. Okay, fish biscuits. Huimao huffed and moved next to Silin. He leaned against Silin's arm and curled his body into a circle, preparing to sleep. He finally said what he had been holding back in his heart. But, what did he want to ask just now? Forget it, let's just think about fish biscuits. Silin looked at the dumb cat who was sleeping like a dumpling beside him, and revealed a smile. This guy. In fact, at that time, Silin also had the idea of taking the first-generation robot's liquid core brain. However, at that time, Frentz was watching the first generation closely, so it was not easy to make a move. The second was that the first generation was not easy to deal with. It was such a big guy, and it moved very fast. Its defense and attack power were both very strong. If he could not take it down in a short time, it would be hard to explain if he was discovered. After the battle ended, he did not have time to look for it. They were both liquid core brains. Other than the way the brain was connected, it should be similar to the second and third generation. With some second and third generation liquid core brains on hand, Silin did not think about getting his hands on the first generation liquid core brain. He did not expect that Huimao would get his hands on one. However, he could not let others know about this core brain. If a big mouth were to leak it, then the Robert family and Vanguard would inevitably have a conflict. After waking up, Silin placed a large bag of fish biscuits in Huimao's personal storage cabinet. This was a cabinet that Huimao had specially made for Silin. Every day, Huimao would rub his own scent on the cabinet and a large area around it. If the Miantuan had any ideas about his cabinet, then Huimao would definitely slap that gluttonous chameleon away. The two captains, Far and Shotten, went to discuss their next plans. At this stage, they were still relatively idle. Many people were experimenting with the new weapons they had obtained. Although they had used them on the battlefield, they could not help but touch them when they were idle. Silin did not do any of these things. He had other things to do. Ever since Enji passed away, the workshop was left to Silin. Regardless of whether it was engineering or biochemical experiments, they could all be done in this workshop. Of course, if it was a large engineering experiment, then it would not be possible. After all, the conditions here were limited. Silin analyzed the liquid core nuclear brains of the level 3 and level 2 robots he had collected. Other than the hardness of the outer shell, the liquid chips inside the nuclear brains were different as well. The complexity and encryption of the chips inside the liquid core brains of the level 2 robots were higher. The data contained and the ability to collect data was twice as high as the liquid core brains of the level 3 robots. However, that was all. Perhaps the superiority of the materials used to construct their bodies was also a factor. However, that was not what Silin wanted to understand. Right now, Silin wanted to understand how these liquid cores were different from the ones he had injected into his body. The composition and structure of the chips inside the level 2 and level 3 robots' brains were similar to the liquid cores inside Silin's body. However, if one were to look deeper into it, there was still a huge difference between them. The liquid core chips in the liquid core brains of the level 2 and level 3 robots were mainly made up of some liquid metal or non-metal materials that contained a large amount of information and computing power. However, the liquid core chips inside Silin's body were biological liquid chips. They were similar to the genes of the main body. They could be integrated into the main body's genetic material and be replicated together. Silin looked at the data on the monitor and closed his eyes to think. After a while, he decided to do an experiment. He took the Robert families and other types of robots and pulled out the various component blueprints. As for the component blueprints of the Robert family's robots, Silin had personally scanned them. After comparing them with other robots, Silin made some changes to some parts and made some small model parts. With these small model parts in hand, Silin started to assemble them. He moved his fingers. It had been a long time since he felt this way. It was as if he had returned to Mo Heng's workshop. It was as if he could see the senior academic ruffian with his legs crossed and a teacup in his hands as he assembled the robot. His 10 fingers moved quickly without any unnecessary movements. Every time he assembled the parts, the strength and angle were just right. One by one, the parts were thrown up, and when they fell, they were moved by a single finger. The next moment, they were firmly installed in the most suitable position. In the brain of this small robot, Sillin installed a simple chip that he had made at the last minute. It was not a liquid core brain, so the operation and computing power were much smaller. However, as the first experimental product, Sillin did not have high expectations for this. There were a lot of parts. After assembling them and confirming that there were no problems with the circuit, he turned on the power. There was no comprehensive precision tester, but Sillin believed that it would not be bad. A small 10-centimeter tall robot standing on the experiment bench immediately seemed to come to life. Sillin gave it a series of commands, and the small robot also performed a series of actions on the experiment bench. It was very smooth, but Sillin still felt that something was missing, and he was still not satisfied. But when the time came, it should be much better to replace it with a liquid core brain. After turning off the power, Sillin disassembled the assembled body. Through the disassembly of the assembly, he could find some problems. After the assembly and disassembly, Sillin changed a part of the design. According to his ideal state, he tried to make the robot more in line with his goals. Finally, the design was more or less changed. This aspect was more or less complete. What was missing now was a suitable metal or some non-metal. The external materials of the robot were also quite important. These materials could not be too active, nor could they be too inert. That way they could be more integrated into the design. But what should he use? Just as Sillin was worrying about this, news came. The result of the discussion between the two captains, Far and Schotten, was to look for rare mineral deposits. Looking for mineral deposits was good news for Sillin now. Chapter 190. In the League of Stars, it was common knowledge that Sector M was the mining area. Many large families and consortiums had set up mining companies in Sector M. However, after so many years, the production of rare metals and precious metals in Sector M had fallen sharply since a long time ago. Therefore, it was common to hear of adventurers and hunters selling the rare metals and precious metals they found after their missions at a high price. There was no need to worry about not being able to find a buyer for those things, and many buyers did not hesitate to fight for those metals. This also showed the importance of those metals. However, such things were not common. For example, the T-13 mine Falvey and the others had found by accident during a mission. Rare minerals like that could only be found by luck. Although there were a lot of minerals in Sector M, those common minerals were not Schotten and Falvey's target. Their target was Sector U of the 13 backward sectors. As a laggard sector among the 13 sectors, the main reason why Sector U could not compare to Sillin's hometown, Sector X, was because of the habitability of the planets in this sector. Unlike Sector Z, Sector U wasn't filled with danger, and electromagnetic storms wouldn't erupt without warning. However, among the many planets in Sector U, planets with a rank A habitability were as rare as a phoenix's feather, and rank B habitability were all heavily developed regions. In Sector U, planets with a rank C and D habitability occupied more than half of the planet population. This was why many commercial companies didn't invest in this place. Without a market, there was not even a lot of cheap labor who would pay attention to this place. If this region was not one of the League of Stars' territories, they probably would not even bother with the formality of stationing troops here. Since this was mainly a mineral exploration mission, their attention was completely focused on this area. They would not waste manpower and resources to pay attention to other areas. Both the 3rd team and the 6th team had a lot of metal detection machines, so they did not need to send people over personally. However, mineral exploration was a boring job. Back when they were searching for habitable planets in Sector Z, they had plenty to do because they had to be vigilant against high-speed moving objects and electromagnetic storms in space at all times. But now that they were in a relatively stable environment like Sector U, the rest of the 3rd team and the 6th team, other than the technical staff, were all entertaining themselves. Since there were a few new members in Sillin's squad, Carrie, Xiaoshang and the others wouldn't be too bored. When they were looking for Udo, they would engage in virtual battles on the microcomputer and tell him jokes that were not suitable for children. The animals would often gather together to play chess as well. Due to Huemao's leadership, they all had their own storage cabinets, and Carrie's storage cabinets were no longer under threat. Whenever he had time, Sillin would study the liquid chips in the workshop, improve all the blueprints, and modify and upgrade the liquid core computer. Modifying the program of the liquid chip isn't an easy task. Because of its complexity, the Robert family usually requires a lot of manpower unless it's mass production. Although the people of the Robert family are very capable in the field of robot manufacturing, and their individual computing ability is also relatively high compared to others, but it still requires more than 3 people to produce a robot to edit the liquid chip. Right now, Sillin was doing the work of 3 people alone, and he was doing it with relative ease. His computing power was several times higher than the Robert family members, and he was about the same as a computing machine. Yudi and Beaver were upgrading the defense system. Diaz and Asha were in their honeymoon phase, and no one would disturb them, and Lycrabe and Tico were busy with their own research. All in all, it was not too boring. Beep, beep. The internal communication devices of the various teams were activated, and the detectors that were sent out finally made a welcome discovery after more than a month had passed. Shot said on the other end of the communicator, based on the analysis of the detector and the data identification, there are at least 2 types of precious minerals on that D-class planet. Captain, can you send me a copy of the analysis? Sillin asked. Sure. After connecting to the control microcomputer in the workshop, Shotten sent a detailed analysis to Sillin. Opening the analysis, Sillin looked at the various data and pictures, and the relevant ratio analysis. His heart skipped a beat. This kind of performance is very suitable. Sillin wanted to build a special robot, and the external materials could not be lower than the first generation of Frunze materials. For this reason, he had specially studied the different products of various robot manufacturers, and studied the composition ratio and related properties of these materials. Based on the design theory, Sillin calculated an ideal mixture of materials. This ratio could change its own properties under certain conditions, adjust its own magnetic field to adapt to different magnetic fields and gravitational forces on some planets, be able to switch between insulation and non-insulation flexibly, have a sense of temperature and decompression, and have good recovery ability. Among the composite materials, there were a few minerals that were very difficult to find. If he were to buy them, it was estimated that even if Sillin took out all the money he had, he would not be able to buy the ideal amount. Sillin did not like substitutes, so he originally decided that if he could not find these ideal minerals, he would not be able to build this robot. Unexpectedly, luck was on his side, and there was progress so quickly. Looking at the data on the screen, Sillin did some calculations, and was quite satisfied with the analysis of the mineral samples that Shotten had sent over. Because it was a D-grade planet, the dispatch team members had to wear protective suits. The good thing was that there were basically no signs of life on D-grade planets, and this planet was the same. After many probes, no signs of life were detected, and there would not be any unknown creatures attacking them. Although the size of the planet was relatively small, it was very rich in mineral resources. The more ordinary mineral resources were fine, and there was no need to waste effort to mine them. They only had to pay attention to the precious mineral resources. Shotten had already discussed with Falvey and set up a few spots with the richest mineral resources, and each team would go to different places. Sillin took a few people in the aircraft and landed at the original coordinates. Wearing protective suits was a little inconvenient, but there was no other way. For the sake of their lives, they had to be careful. Sending out the mineral detector, Sillin looked at the screen in his hand. The places with precious mineral resources in this area were all displayed. After transmitting the detection information to the microcomputers in the hands of each team member, he opened the toolbox and sent out the mining machinery to prepare for mining. Chiefing did not carry any tools. It was his first time wearing protective suits, and he was obviously not used to it. Coupled with the environment of this planet, Chiefing's movements were stiff. Therefore, Sillin tried to let him familiarize himself with the process, and he could just watch and learn from the side. Shueqia was wearing a protective suit that was almost circular. Because he did not have any special protective suits, and because he did not want to be left on the starship, Sillin made a protective suit to cover himself. Now this white fatty was rolling around looking very fresh, and did not seem to be out of place at all. Huimao was the only one in this team who did not wear protective suits, but this guy was still jumping around in this area, making everyone jealous. Because Huimao was free, Sillin gave him some verification programs. If there were mineral resources that could match the verification program, he would collect some. Watching Huimao running away, Sillin waved his hand. Let's start. When the two kinds of precious minerals were mined, Sillin used his upgraded scanner to scan them. The metal contained in the mineral resources was what Sillin urgently needed to build robots, and Sillin was very happy about this. 2 of the mineral resources here were enough. According to the internal rules of the hunter group, the mined mineral resources could be sold or kept for themselves. The choice was up to them. Sillin would distribute the mined mineral resources to everyone, and they could decide for themselves. Part of his own would be used to make mixed materials. While Sillin and the others were busy mining, Huimao sent a message that they had found a mineral resource that matched Sillin's verification program, but it was not on the surface of the planet. In short, they had to dig deep. Sillin looked at the information sent by Huimao and the rock formation scan. These mining machines could not complete the mining at that depth, but other machines that specialized in mining deeper could not reach that depth either. This was because before reaching the mineral resource, they would have to pass through a magnetic mining area. According to the data provided by Huimao, the strength of the magnetic field would seriously affect the operation of the machines, and deep mining machines could not reach that depth. Most importantly, it seemed that only a small area had the mineral resources. It seems that there is a relatively simple way. And so, while no one was aware, Huimao transformed. This transformation did not happen on the surface of the planet. It should be known that everything that happened on the surface of the planet was displayed on the external satellite monitoring system of the 2 starships. Sillin had no intention of revealing Huimao's background to the 3rd B Squadron just yet. It was possible that Falvey already knew some things about Huimao, but there were some key things that he did not know. Huimao first burrowed into the ground in cat form, and then transformed inside. The monitoring system would not detect the exact changes. At most, it would detect that there was a life form moving under the surface of the planet. But right now everyone was busy mining, and the technicians on the starships were busy analyzing the mineral resources. As long as it was not a foreign life form or some other threat, the monitoring and scanning system would not sound an alarm. It was true that Huimao did not discover a lot of mineral resources. After purification, it was probably only enough to build 1 robot, and the remaining materials were not enough to build the composite outer shell of a second robot. Huimao had also released some crystals when he was mining the mineral resources. After the scanning system confirmed that Huimao had never seen this kind of crystal before, and when he was on the surface, he did not detect any signal or reaction related to this crystal. At first, Huimao thought that this crystal was a little strange, so he took a look at it out of curiosity, and was about to leave. Before he left, he habitually used Sillin's verification program to test this crystal, but who would have thought that a super compatibility would actually pop up? Huimao was dumbfounded. The metal mineral deep inside the planet was only at excellent grade out of 100%, but this crystal actually had a super compatibility. He hurriedly told this news to Sillin. Sillin was still a little stunned when he found out. The concept of super was just an upper limit that Sillin set for insurance. According to Sillin's theory, excellent should actually be the upper limit. After all, there was a gap between reality and theory, but he did not expect that there would really be something that could reach the theoretical upper limit. Huimao found that the thing was not easy to mine. It was a sphere with a diameter of 3 meters. Because of this crystal, Sillin directly handed the mining over to Diaz, and went to where Huimao was. He used machinery to expand the hole that Huimao had drilled. However, the surface was relatively narrow, and Huimao had drilled the hole in a different form, so there was no need for machinery to expand it. Following the hole, Sillin arrived at the place that Huimao had mentioned. Opening the protective cover, Sillin took off the protective suit, and reached out to touch the sphere. The moment he touched it, a large amount of data was cleared. It really was the theoretical value. Because the theoretical value of this design was originally on the high side, some researchers even thought it was impossible to achieve. Sillin did not expect to actually encounter something that could reach the theoretical value. This crystal was spherical, but it was not a solid sphere. It had a core, and then countless branches extended from this core. Each branch was a strange and complicated thin crystal column. These thin crystal columns seemed to be covering the core with a thick layer of fluff. With a wave of his hand, Sillin kept the crystal ball into the leaf pattern ring. At the same time, he kept some of the minerals that Huimao had already excavated, and held the remaining minerals in his hand. It should be noted that most people's subspace containers could not be used on a D-class habitable planet. Therefore, even when Sillin and Huimao walked out like this, no one suspected that Sillin was hiding anything. After dealing with the matters here, Sillin returned to the surface and headed to the mining area of the small team. Meanwhile, Huimao continued its journey underground. It found that searching for minerals underground was quite interesting. At least it was better than the boring mining outside with the others. However, to Huimao's disappointment, other than the spherical crystal, there were no other materials that had reached the super compatibility. There was not even any that had reached the excellent grade. There was only one other mineral that was of the same grade as the one they were mining. Even so, it was enough to make Shoten and Falvey happy. 3 types of precious minerals were enough for them to make a fortune. Yes, they could sell a portion, and hand over the rest to the main team. This would greatly increase the influence of the 2 teams in the Vanguard Hunter group. After each team had finished mining, they returned to the starship. As for how these minerals should be handled, Sillin had long since decided. After taking away his portion, Sillin went back to the workshop and got busy. The others all chose to sell it. They all chose to sell it together with the rest of the team, and then split the money. Sillin was assembling in the workshop. Now that some of the other parts had been taken care of, the main thing was to choose the main material for the robot. The spherical crystal that Huimao had found contained an unknown element. However, under certain conditions, it could be temporarily converted to a known nonmetallic element or another known metallic element. After a detailed analysis of its properties, Sillin was ecstatic. This was the perfect material for his theoretical design. Not only could it withstand pressure and restore memories, it was also the triple defense material that Sillin had been looking for. It could resist high-energy radiation, strong acids and alkalis, and electromagnetic interference. Luck was a thing that was impossible to fathom. It was true that their luck this time was too good. Many people might not be able to find such a material even after searching for a lifetime, or several generations. The Robert family, for example, had never found such a material. Huimao was the absolute hero. The team continued their search in Sector U. Since they had found 3 types of precious minerals, the psychological pressure on the 2 captains had lessened a lot. It didn't matter even if they found nothing else in the remaining time. 10 days had passed since Sillin went back to the workshop. During these 10 days, Huimao stayed in the workshop and watched Sillin build the robot. He even dragged his own storage cabinet over, slept when he was tired, ate when he woke up, and continued watching after eating. Huimao could rest, but Sillin couldn't even sleep for a moment during these 10 days. An enormous amount of calculations, an enormous amount of work, and an assembly that could not be stopped once it started. Although they relied on some synthesizing instruments most of the time, the key parts were all led by Sillin. There was no room for sloppiness. 10 days later, Sillin went out to replenish his energy before going back to the workshop and continuing the rest of the perfecting work. What on earth is Lieutenant Sillin doing right now? Yudos asked while lying on a chair after exiting the virtual combat. Who knows, but this lieutenant has never disappointed anyone. Let me tell you a secret, Yudos. Carrie moved closer and said mysteriously. The last time this lieutenant stayed in the workshop for a few days, he went to destroy a planet the moment he came out. Seeing Yudos' mouth open into a big O shape, Xiaoshang curled his lips. It's a pity that we weren't there when they went to destroy Poison Fong. We couldn't see the scene. Badao also echoed from the side. The incident with Poison Fong had left a pretty deep impression on them. It was also that incident that caused everyone to feel a sense of reverence towards Sillin. I wonder what will happen when Lieutenant Sillin comes out this time. Yudo's eyes were filled with anticipation. Xiaoshang, Carrie, and the others thought of something at the same time, and wore odd expressions on their faces. Right now they were thinking, it can't be another parasite, can it? They only had a rough understanding of the incident with Poison Fang, but they had seen the emblem on Poison Fang's members, and the last skeleton of Skeleton King with their own eyes. Even without the parasites, they still felt chills run down their spines. Rubbing his stomach, Carrie stood up and stretched his arms. I'm going to get some food. Do you want to bring it? Of course. Do you even need to ask? Xiaoshang listed a few types of portable food in one go. Carrie returned a disdainful gesture, opened the door and walked out. Because of the food Badao listed, Carrie turned around and cursed a bit at them. He didn't want to bump into someone, and even step on the person's foot when he backed out with his back facing the door. Oh, I'm sorry. Carrie was about to turn around and apologize when he suddenly realized that he didn't know this person. Why would a stranger appear in this squad when no other members had been notified? Carrie's body immediately tensed up, and he entered a high alert state. Why does this person not have any signs of life? Chapter 191. Hey Carrie. What's wrong? Xiaoshang stood up and asked when he saw Carrie's high alert state. At the same time, everyone in the room took out their weapons, adjusted themselves to their best combat state, and moved towards the door. Carrie stared at the stranger in front of him with cold sweat on his forehead. This person was definitely not from the 6th Division. Carrie was very familiar with the internal personnel of the 6th Division after so many years. Whether it was the combat personnel, technical personnel, or logistics personnel, Carrie had memorized every single one of their faces. But he shouldn't be from the 3rd B Squadron either. If the 3rd B Squadron had such a person, Carrie would definitely have an impression of him. He would never forget a person he met for the first time. No breathing, no heartbeat, no sense of warmth. Other than its human appearance, there was nothing human about it at all. It was like a dead object. Carrie's eyebrows twitched. Could this be a robot the captain got from friends? That couldn't be right. Both squads were a little scared of robots because of the betrayal of the robots. They always thought that there was a hidden danger, so they didn't want robots at all. Then what was this person in front of him? While Carrie was staring at the stranger in front of him with his entire body on high alert, Xiaoshang and the others had arrived behind Carrie. They saw that the stranger had stopped in front of the door with a warm smile on his face. He didn't look hostile at all, and he didn't look human at all. Moreover, Xiaoshang discovered that their communicators had lost contact with the outside world. There was no signal in the surroundings. What on earth happened? Who are you? Carrie asked in a deep voice. The weapons in their hands were all ready. If the person in front of them made any strange movements, they would not hesitate to attack. The person smiled warmly and raised his hand. Hello. Carrie's face twitched a little. Is this a handshake? Who would be stupid enough to shake hands with a complete stranger in a situation like this? That was why Carrie still stuck to the principle of not moving until the enemy moved. He ignored the outstretched hand of the man in front of him. The person didn't look angry at Carrie's indifference at all. He withdrew his hand with a warm smile on his face and looked very sincere. Hello, I'm Cheto. His voice was neither fast nor slow, making one feel as if they were bathing in the spring breeze. I don't care what your name is. Cheto cut him before Carrie could finish. I know who you are. Carrie Xiaoshang Badao. Cheto looked at Carrie and the others again and said their names. Carrie and the others thought to themselves, damn, the information is quite complete. While everyone was on guard against Cheto, Cheto nodded at them and took a step toward Carrie. At the same time, a figure suddenly jumped out from behind Cheto. Wa-la-la. Just when they were highly nervous because of the attraction, a strange voice suddenly appeared. Carrie's lightsaber and Xiaoshang and the others almost fired their guns. What the fuck? Carrie felt that his heart had almost jumped out of his chest. He pointed a trembling finger at the cat head that popped out from behind Cheto and said, Why were you? Carrie couldn't say anything for a long time and panted heavily. Xiaoshang and the others were almost the same. Silen, they're scared, haha. Huimao said smugly while standing on Cheto's shoulder. It was only when they saw Silen walking over from behind Cheto that they truly relaxed. Xiaoshang leaned against the door and looked like he was about to collapse. Fuck, I was even wondering if they were Azrael's men. As he spoke, Xiaoshang wiped the sweat off his forehead. His back was also drenched in cold sweat. What a scam. That was so scary. I thought of Azrael too, Ba Dao said while flexing his overly tense muscles. He glanced at his communicator and found that it was back to normal. Xiaoshang shook his head and said, "Are you punishing us for not doing our jobs, Lieutenant Silen?" Silen simply smiled at Xiaoshang's complaint before pointing at Cheto and saying, "Allow me to introduce you. This is the result of my research during this time. It's an AI robot, Cheto." It really is a robot. Carrie scuttled over to take a look before circling around Cheto twice. Something's wrong with it. It gives me a different feeling than France's robots. I can't put my finger on it, but it just feels different. Humph, this is the result of Silen's and my research. Of course it's not something a guy like France can compare to. Huimao said while looking up from Cheto's shoulder. Carrie and the others curled their lips at Silen's words. You and Silen's research? Who would believe that? I'm afraid that Silen was the one doing the research while you were eating fish biscuits at the side, right? Carrie and the others were right. However, Huimao would definitely give them a good beating if they said it out loud. Truth be told, Huimao's contribution to Cheto's creation couldn't go unnoticed. If Huimao hadn't found the ideal material, Cheto's creation would have been delayed. Therefore, when Silen created Cheto, Huimao categorized Cheto as one of his own. To be specific, he was a lackey. Xiaoshang moved closer and squeezed Cheto's arm curiously. This feeling, is he really a robot? Not only could he see the blood vessels, he could even feel the fluid flowing inside them. TSK, are these blood vessels? Cheto didn't say anything. He extended a finger, and his fingernails suddenly grew long. Then he cut a 2-centimeter deep wound on his other arm. There was no blood. It looked like a normal human wound, but no blood flowed out. Then, under Carrie and the others' astonished gazes, the wound swiftly healed and returned to its original state. What the fuck? Carrie didn't know what to say right now. They had seen the rebellion between the robots at France's place before. When Rank 4 and Rank 5 robots were torn apart by Rank 2 robots, they definitely didn't reveal the color of flesh and blood that Cheto's was. If Cheto could pass off the fake as the real thing, then Beaver and France's robots were even more realistic. Don't treat Cheto like a robot at France's place. He has developed his own intelligence. Moreover, he can adjust his body temperature and heartbeat to the same as a human's. Silen briefly introduced Cheto's characteristics. However, Carrie and the others were a little worried about Cheto's existence. Everyone in the squad would raise their hands in approval if Cheto was placed at the front, but everyone had just experienced a large-scale rebellion at France's place, and they were extremely sensitive to the word robot. There were definitely a lot of people in the squad who didn't care about Cheto's existence. It was just as Carrie and the others thought. When Silen brought Cheto to Shotten and the lieutenant commanders, more than half of them voted against the idea. Shotten didn't say anything until now. He simply stared at Cheto in silence. Huimao was lying on top of Cheto's head. There were a couple of times when he almost couldn't stop himself from refuting Cheto. If Silen hadn't told him to stay silent, he would have rushed up and scratched Cheto a long time ago. You think our Cheto can't compare to your useless subordinates? If Huimao said what he thought, even Shotten would flip a table. Silen knew that Huimao wouldn't choose his words carefully when he was angry. That was why he told him to stay silent. Shotten tapped the table with his finger, and the discussion in the room came to a halt. Shotten looked at Silen and said, Silen, how can you guarantee that he won't be like France's robots? Don't tell me about the first-generation robot. No one can guarantee that it's just a test by Azrael. I'm the only one who knows the final control code. If anyone else tries to hack it, it will cause the opposite effect. This is also the improvement I made after analyzing the first-generation robot and the other generations of France's robots, as well as the robots produced by the other manufacturers in the League of Stars. The others wanted to say something, but Shotten stopped them with a hand. Are you sure something like France won't happen again? I'm sure. Sillin looked Shotten straight in the eye without backing down. Good. Shotten looked around and said, I agree with Cheto's existence, but due to everyone's different attitudes, Cheto can only move around within your squad's area for now. Sure. Sillin didn't care about this. Even if he agreed to move around, he wouldn't allow Cheto to leave his squad's area. After Sillin and Cheto returned to the squad's area, Yudi and Beaver even stopped what they were doing and waited for them. Did you agree? Cheto was still the same as before. He was scratching Huemao's chin with one hand and stroking Huemao's hair with the other. However, even Carrie couldn't catch the moving program on the screen of the microcomputer. All he could see were a series of characters and programs flashing by. Lycrabe tried to look into Cheto's eyes, but he couldn't see anything. He still looked the same as before. Lycrabe thought that he had seen all kinds of high-end robots when he was young, but compared to the one in front of him, they were nothing but background characters. A mysterious and unfathomable robot could be guessed by a person's body movements or expression, but a robot couldn't. How on earth did Sillin create such a strange guy? Yudi and Beaver were sweating profusely, and their fingers were moving faster than before. However, it was obvious from their expressions that the situation wasn't in their favor. A glance was all it took for a layman to realize the difference between the two sides. Compared to Yudi and Beaver, Cheto was simply too relaxed. He looked like he wasn't paying attention at all. Then a holographic image slowly appeared on the projector at the center of the table. It was a very comical image. A lot of people had seen a cross made of two bones, and a skull above a bone fork. The image they were seeing now was similar, but it wasn't a cross made of two bones. Instead, it was a cross made of two slender fish biscuits. Above the cross was not a skull, but a cat's head. It was Huemao's cat head. Yudi and Beaver had stopped what they were doing and looked at each other. They nearly vomited blood when they saw it. Is this guy going to stay like this forever? Yudi and Beaver turned to look at Carrie and the others. Everyone stole sympathetic looks at them. Yudi flexed his aching arms and fingers before smiling helplessly. It's a species advantage. Beaver was feeling the same way. He wouldn't have competed if he knew this was going to happen. At the same time, both Yudi and Beaver noticed something. Only 1 minute had passed since the beginning of the duel, and it was exactly 1 second shorter than the other. This meant that it wasn't a coincidence. Neither Yudi nor Beaver believed that it was a coincidence. This meant that Cheto had been holding back. I concede defeat. In fact, both Yudi and Beaver had tried to hack into Cheto's core control program while they were fighting for control of the projector. But forget hacking, they couldn't even find a signal connection. They had no idea how Cheto ran the program at all. Neither Yudi nor Beaver were sore losers. Moreover, they were happy that they had gained a new helper. With a guy like that, Yudi and Beaver would be working on that protective network they were working on would move even faster. Hunters relied on their strength to communicate and win respect, even if Cheto was just a robot. Everyone in this squad, be it human or non-human, possessed a certain level of ability. Even the Miantuan was a little expert in certain aspects, let alone Shueqiu and the little rabbit. Diaz was very happy. Handing over his position to Sillin was a wise choice. Big brother Sillin, I have a question, Tang Qiuqiu said. Ask away. Why is he called Cheto? Did you give him that name, Big brother Sillin? No, we did. At first, Sillin was going to call him X or Shadow X, but Huimao said that Shadow X sounded too bad, so he decided to call him Cheto instead. That was how Cheto was born. The first time 6th Division accepted Cheto was when he was mining on a rank D habitable planet. Maybe it was because the two squads ran out of luck at the beginning, but they didn't find anything for a long time after that. It made sense. After all, Sector U wasn't as dangerous as Sector Z, and there were still a lot of treasure hunters there. Every time someone came, they would come with the intention of picking up a treasure. It was absolutely incredible luck that they were able to discover a precious mineral deposit on that planet, so soon after the exploration began. But after a period of silence, the detector finally reacted again. Although the mineral deposit this time wasn't as valuable as the previous one, the selling price was still satisfactory. Everyone was still wearing their protective suits, except for the two anomalies, Huimao and Cheto. The situation was like this. When Shotten was mining the mineral deposit, he discovered some energy blocks of good quality. However, the energy blocks happened to be located at a magnetic interference point, and coupled with the image of the geomagnetic ores, the mining machines stopped working by the time they reached the place. Shotten was determined to obtain these energy ores. After all, it wasn't easy to discover energy ores of such quality. After discussing with the lieutenant commanders, Sillin contacted Cheto directly. And so, under the shocked gazes of Shotten, the lieutenant commanders, and the surrounding squad members, Cheto nimbly crawled into the mining hole, threw out the machines stuck inside, and dug out the energy ores with his bare hands. The energy blocks might not be big, but their combined weight was definitely comparable to a small space plane. Cheto calmly stored the energy ores into a long bag, and easily dragged it out of the hole. He didn't use any machines at all. Everyone couldn't help but twitch when they saw this. Robots are so fucking good. Everyone in the squad was tolerant towards meritorious contributors. Moreover, Shotten was looking at Cheto like he was looking at an extremely valuable mineral deposit right now. One had to know that Cheto wasn't affected by the word machine at all. In fact, he didn't even have any side effects from the magnetic field. What a treasure! What a precious treasure! After he was done moving the energy ores, Cheto patted his clothes and returned to his previous appearance. He didn't look as messy as the others who entered the mining hole. In the following days, Cheto was accepted by more and more people in the 6th Division, and he officially established himself in the 6th team. Chapter 192. Although there weren't any delightful harvests in the latter part of the journey, it was still a rare find. Even if there was only one type of rare mineral, it would be a worthwhile trip, not to mention that there was more than one type of rare mineral in this trip. The original plan was to use 50 days to search for the minerals, but in reality it took 60 days. This was because they found some energy ores later on. Although the quality was not good, they were still usable. Therefore, the two team leaders decided to use the energy ores to support the rest of the search and extend the search time. On the 60th day, the two team leaders gave the order to leave Sector U. They did not run into too much trouble this time. They did not run into any robbers, and although they did run into people from Heaven's Birth, everyone just greeted each other and went their separate ways. Lon Hudi still kept a low profile, and Mist and Wuxia seemed to have evaporated into thin air once more. Everyone thought that things had calmed down for now, or this trip would not have been so easy. Sillin did not think that those guys would calm down so easily. The reason they did not run into chaos might be because the conflict did not happen in this area. Perhaps a great conflict was happening somewhere in the League of Stars while everyone thought that everything was peaceful. However, those were not what Sillin was thinking about right now. If he did not have the ability, he would not have the right to speak even if he came into contact with that level. He could only be cannon fodder. Are we still going to Sector I this time? Inside the meeting room, Huaqin asked Shotten. Normally speaking, if they did not accept certain missions beforehand, they would first submit the information they found to the A Squad, and then decide the fate of these minerals through the A Squad. Usually, the A Squad would keep a portion of the minerals according to their needs, and sell the rest at a high price. This time was no exception. Shotten nodded. After discussing with Captain Falvey, the result is still to go to the City of Trade Rare Era. The team leaders had already expected this decision. To sell these rare minerals at a satisfactory price, going to the City of Trade Rare Era was the best choice. The City of Trade in the Rare Era that Shotten spoke of wasn't a place similar to an ordinary city like people thought. Although the City of Trade in the Rare Era also used the word city, it was actually much, much larger than the city that people spoke of. The Rare Era City of Trade was located on Planet I-100 of Sector I. This planet wasn't small, and it was 5 times larger than Sillin's birthplace, Planet Brown Earth. From space, Planet I-100 only had one continental plate, and this continental plate occupied 70% of the planet's surface area. The rest of the area was the sea, with a few scattered islands of different sizes. The rare era that Schotten mentioned was the city of trade. The entire continental plate was a city of trade, and it was the largest and most famous trading venue in Sector I. Valuable trades were taking place at every moment. The city of trade rare era had a history of thousands of years. Thousands of years ago, a few merchants developed the planet's only continental plate into a trading venue, and after thousands of years of development, the present rare era city of trade had become one of the wealthiest places in the League of Stars. Although this city of trade had a long history, the truth was that the style of this city leaned towards the retro. There was no lack of ancient buildings that had a long history, and those well-preserved buildings that were filled with an ancient atmosphere were places that some of the literary researchers and artists in the League of Stars fell in love with. The city of trade rare era was also the largest trading and processing place for rare minerals in Sector I. Many famous gems, enviable energy blocks, and rare materials that many forces coveted were traded out of this place. It was exactly because of the City of Trade's uniqueness that the City of Trade's security was ranked near the top in the entire League of Stars. Its security measures were even more complete than some places in Sector A. Therefore, as long as a transaction of great value was done in the City of Trade, no one would come out to rob it. Of course, what would happen after leaving this planet was not the concern of the City of Trade's guards. Besides, the people who came here to trade were all capable and had a background. Ordinary robbers would not be able to rob them. This time, the two teams were going to put the precious minerals they found up for auction at the trading venue. There was no need to worry about not being able to sell the precious minerals, and many people who urgently needed these minerals would stand guard at the trading venue all day long. They would check the traded items in the entire City of Trade, and if they found something they liked or needed, they would rush to the auction venue of their own accord. The items and samples had already been submitted to the people of the rare era trading venue, and the auction of these precious minerals would begin 5 days later. However, these minerals would be auctioned separately and not together. If they were put together, the price would be too high, and many people would not be able to get their hands on the money at first notice. Therefore, they would be auctioned separately to give the buyers some buffer time to raise their funds. This way, they would be able to sell these precious minerals at a higher price. Planet I-100's security was very strict. Many people had to go through several layers of checks to prevent dangerous items and unknown viruses from entering the planet. This wasn't the first time Carrie had come here, but he was especially nervous this time. It wasn't because of himself, but because of the non-human behind him. The group passed through the security passage one by one. Sillin passed through the passage safely, and the Huimao on Sillin's shoulder did not trigger any alarm either. Behind Sillin, Cheto slowly walked into the passageway. Carrie and the others who had already passed through the passageway felt their hearts beating wildly. He had once seen a man with a miniature grenade who didn't repent even after he triggered the alarm inside the passageway, causing countless gun barrels and other weapons to suddenly appear around the passageway. Because the person was carrying a miniature grenade, he was frozen into an iceman by the ultra-low temperature gun that looked like a porcupine. As for guns and whatnot, as long as their attack power did not exceed the limit, they would be returned to the person who passed through the security passage after passing through the security passage. But a person like Cheto probably wouldn't be executed immediately, would he? At most, he would be given a serious warning and kicked out. It would be a lie if Sillin said he wasn't nervous. Although he was confident, he hadn't gone through an actual test like this before. That being said, Cheto was taking a certain amount of risk by coming here. As Cheto walked through the passage step by step, Sillin and the others' hearts rose and fell. No alarm went off, and the final test results still showed that he was an average human. Schotten gave Sillin a thumbs up. Not even Frunze's robots could come up with an average human. Could they? Tang Qiuqiu was also clamoring to tag along. She wanted to buy some candy, and she heard that the candy here was a very rare type. Although it was very expensive, Tang Qiuqiu was willing to buy it. Xueqiu tagged along as well. The security passage didn't classify this kind of animal as a threat. Walking on the streets of the rare era, One couldn't help but feel like they had returned to the ancient era. There were no tall buildings that reached into the clouds, and the air was filled with a strong ancient wind. Shatten and Falvey brought a couple of people to the auction house they contacted earlier. The others had their own time to do their own thing. Silen's group was divided into 4 groups. Tico and Lycrabe went to the medical trade centers. Carrie, Xiaoshang, Beaver, and Ba Dao went for a stroll. Carrie said that the bars here were very tasty, so he left with his group. Dias and Asha, on the other hand, went for a world of their own. In fact, Silen was going to go with Carrie and the others, but Tang Qiuqiu wanted to buy candy. That was why Silen told Carrie and the others that he would look for them at the bar after he bought the candy. Cheto and Xiuqiu followed Silen, and Qifeng as well. This was the first time Qifeng had seen an environment like this, so he was obviously very curious. Although he couldn't help but be vigilant out of habit, he was more curious than anything else. On the other hand, Cheto was constantly collecting new information, but he still looked gentle on the surface. Unlike Qifeng, he didn't reveal his curiosity and vigilance at all. Following the distribution map of the City of Trade, the group arrived at Sweet Street. This street was full of desserts, and Huimao was clamoring for Tang Qiuqiu to buy candy as soon as possible, so that they could go to a commercial street next door that specialized in luxury pet products to buy fish biscuits. However, Tang Qiuqiu couldn't resist all kinds of candy. She bit her finger in hesitation. She really wanted to buy the entire street. Hey Qiuqiu, hurry up. Qifeng and I still need to go to the neighboring street to buy something. Huimao said impatiently while crouching on Silen's shoulder. Tang Qiuqiu ignored Huimao's complaints. While she was hesitating, she was suddenly attracted by a loud noise. It was a rustic shop. The flowers and plants on the windowsill were actually made of sugar. The windowsill, which looked like it was made of wood or stone, was actually made of sugar as well. Overall, it had a kind of retro and sweet style. Tang Qiuqiu wasn't attracted by the layout of the shop, but by a huge lollipop that was slowly rising above the shop. That was a free sample tasting sign. Big brother Silen, wait here. I'll go grab the candy. Before Silen could say anything, Tang Qiuqiu ran over. Xiuqiu also ran over and squeezed with a group of children who were about the same age as Tang Qiuqiu. Seeing that the people who squeezed over were all children, Silen stood aside. Only when it came to candy, Tang Qiuqiu would become like a child. There was an unwritten rule on this street that only children were allowed to grab candy, and adults weren't allowed to participate. Therefore, there were some bodyguards, nannies, parents, and the like standing on the periphery shouting to remind them not to get stepped on. This shop was actually a small branch set up by a sugar processing factory. These various types of candy were heavily advertised. Every day, many people would submit a large number of orders because their children liked it. The candy here was very expensive. One could tell just by looking at the logo. It was considered a luxury item among the sweets. A small bag of candy was equivalent to a flying car. However, no matter how expensive it was, it couldn't stop the footsteps of the candy lovers in the League of Stars, such as Tang Qiuqiu. Just when the group of children was fighting over the candy, there was a sudden pa-pa-pa sound from not far away. Then, a big ball floating in the air exploded with a loud bang, and the candy inside fell like rain. It was another free candy grab. The surrounding children all rushed over there. Silen's gaze turned over. Qiuqiu, why don't you go grab it? Silen's voice stopped abruptly because he didn't see Tang Qiuqiu and Xiuqiu. It was impossible for Silen to miss them. If Tang Qiuqiu and Xiuqiu gave up on the candy grab and went over, they wouldn't be able to avoid Silen's sight. How could this be? Chapter 193. Silen, Qifeng, Huimao and Cheto had all moved their eyes away from the sound just now. In the blink of an eye, Tang Qiuqiu and Xiuqiu were gone. The communicator could not be connected, and even the signal device on Tang Kakikia's body did not respond. Everything happened in an instant. Qifeng suddenly tensed up and turned into a highly vigilant state, the claws on his hands popping out. Qifeng, what happened? There's something strange, a very disgusting smell. Cheto, Silen said solemnly. Cheto might have moved his eyes away just now, but the monitor was still there. It just wasn't his eyes. Cheto opened his hand, and a projection appeared on his palm. It was the scene of what happened at the shop earlier. Tang Qiuqiu's figure was very obvious among the many little radishes, especially the fair fatty behind her. Then a black shadow flashed, and Tang Qiuqiu and Xueqiu disappeared. And at that moment, there was a loud noise on the other side. Slowing down the video, Silin saw that Tang Qiuqiu and Xueqiu were wrapped up by something that looked like a tentacle. He had no idea what it was, but it should be very slippery and fast. In the end, it flashed towards one of the exits on this street. Huimao sniffed the air. There's no scent of Tang Qiuqiu and the other two. The culprit is very cunning. And the thing that took them away had the scent of sugar on it. And it blended in with the surroundings. But it can't escape my nose. Both Qifeng and Huimao could smell the scent of the thing that took Tang Qiuqiu and Xueqiu away. Without Huimao leading the way, Qifeng's reaction was stronger. The thing that could make Qifeng react like this was definitely not a normal human. Qifeng led the way, and Silin chased after them with Huimao and Cheto at the back. Cheto's search speed was incredibly fast. While he was doing so, he copied all the images captured by the surveillance equipment in the area without letting anyone else know about it. Judging from the footage, Tang Qiuqiu and the others were taken into a seemingly ordinary flying car after they left the street. Without these surveillance footage, it would have been very difficult to track them even if they could sniff out their scent at the beginning. Silin immediately rented a flying car from the automated flying car rental area and chased after him. The other party was very fast, and since there was a speed limit in this place, the other party had been driving at the highest speed possible. Moreover, he was driving very skillfully, so it was obvious that the other party was no ordinary person. Along the way, the culprit switched flying cars, and Tang Qiuqiu and the others were taken into a building. However, a different flying car flew out of the building's exit, and Tang Qiuqiu and the others were probably inside it. Under the joint pursuit of Cheto and Huimao, they finally arrived at a port. This was one of the 5 main ports in the city of exchange. Obviously, the culprit had noticed Silin's pursuit, and they had done a lot of concealment measures after arriving here. Now it was very difficult to distinguish them from the surveillance footage and aura alone. Why did they want to capture Tang Qiuqiu and the others? Who were the ones who had captured them? This was the question that Silin couldn't answer no matter how hard he thought about it. What do we do, Silin? Should we split up and search for them first? Huimao asked. Silin didn't answer. He had calmed down and thought through some key things. They arrived at a quiet corner, and fell silent for more than 10 seconds. Finally Silin said, "No, don't split up. We may have been targeted from the beginning. The culprit must have made a thorough plan, but we won't find anything even if we investigate the candy store and the origin of that floating ball. Cheto, remember to send the situation here to Carrie and the captain. Qifeng and I will chase after them directly, or we won't make it in time." "Qifeng, follow me and don't leave my side," Silin said to Qifeng. "Amen." Scarlet Wind's eyes were filled with anger and murderous intent. He unintentionally stretched out his long claws a little more, but Silin patted them lightly before he forced himself to retract them. After all, there were too many people here. "Cheto, you and Weez go find the captain and the others." Silin and Qifeng walked into the airport while Huimao and Cheto drove the flying car into the airport. Qifeng followed closely behind Silin. He didn't understand why they were doing this. Weez and Cheto could play an important role in tracking down the culprit, but why did they leave now? Qifeng believed in Silin's decision, so he did as he was told even though he was puzzled. "Qifeng, this is the direction, right?" Silin asked. Qifeng nodded. He was very familiar with the smell. It was an annoying smell that couldn't be washed away even with disinfectant. Although the culprit had tried to cover it up, Qifeng could identify the direction of the smell if he spent some time. The two of them arrived at a spaceplane parking lot. There were not many people here. Scarlet Wind was about to say something when his hair suddenly stood on end. Based on his beastly instincts, he knew that there was danger here. However, his vigilance was taken away by the sudden and violent anesthesia. He swayed a few times and collapsed. Next to Scarlet Wind, Silin was also lying on the ground. Both of them had an extremely thin needle in their bodies. This kind of needle was almost silent when it was shot out, and it was extremely fast. Other than that, the thin needle contained an extremely strong knockout drug. Even a rank A genotype would not be able to withstand it. After the duo collapsed, some people came out of the spaceplanes one after another. No one would have thought that these spaceplanes that seemed to come from different places and forces actually belonged to the same boss. The surroundings had been isolated at some point. There were no outsiders except for a few guards, but these guards turned a blind eye to the behavior of these people. After a brief exchange of glances, the guards left. After the people who came out of the spaceplane examined Sillin and Qifeng and confirmed that they were unconscious, they brought Sillin and Qifeng into the spaceplane. When the spaceplane flew up, no one noticed that at the bottom of the spaceplane that Sillin was brought in, there were two protrusions that seemed to be similar to the surrounding. Moreover, these two protrusions were communicating in some way without the security system of the spaceplane noticing. Not long after, these spaceplanes left the port and drove into space. In the huge spaceport, there was a starship parked. There was a symbol on the starship, which looked like a 6, that rotated clockwise by 225 degrees, but the arc of this 6 was larger and the tail was longer. If Sillin saw this symbol, he would be surprised because it was the kind of people that Shoten didn't want to contact the most. In a room on the starship, two people were having a conversation. You actually mobilized the experimentals to capture people? A man in a black suit who looked like he had just come out from a gathering said with unsuppressed anger in his tone. Opposite the man in the black suit sat a middle-aged man. At this time, the middle-aged man was looking at the information recorded on the electronic record book in his hand, and was not afraid of the man in the suit's stern questioning. Raising his head, the excitement in the middle-aged man's eyes had not subsided. "Caldwell, you can't imagine what kind of creature we've got." The middle-aged man pulled up a few items of data on the electronic record book and handed it to Caldwell, who had just attended a large auction. Although Caldwell was dissatisfied with the middle-aged man's actions, when he saw the data on the electronic record book, his face immediately cleared up. However, as a member of the management, he still had to maintain a proper attitude. With a straight face, he handed the electronic record book back to the middle-aged man. "Shelt, the higher-ups have told us many times not to cause any trouble at this time. The military has already sent a report, and there are also some discordant voices from the political groups. We still have to pay attention to our own actions." "Of course I know that, but we've coincidentally encountered a rare specimen and template creature. We can't just give up, can we? This is several times better than the previous batch of experimentals." Shelt's gaze rested on the electronic record book as he looked at the test data that was sent back one after another. "Which side are they from?" Caldwell loosened his bow tie and asked. "I've checked. They're from Vanguard Division 6. Caldwell's eyebrows were raised when he heard the words Vanguard, but he calmed down when he heard the words B Squadron. After all, the B Squadron did not need the A Squadron, and the loss of a few people from the B Squadron would not affect the A Squadron. "Forget it this time. Don't make any moves during this period. If you affect the entire miracle, all your experiments will be razed to the ground." "Of course I'm aware of that." As for the matter of capturing Sillin and Qifeng, Shelt had only casually mentioned it. Besides, Qifeng was also a rare test subject for Shelt, so he did not want to report too much from the bottom of his heart. It just so happened that Caldwell was a little busy today, and there were some things that he had to pay attention to that the higher-ups had notified him of. Therefore, he did not spend any more effort on what Shelt was doing today. At this time, in a surveillance room on the starship, Sillin felt the restraints on his limbs. He did not move, nor did he open his eyes. Even his body remained in a state that one would expect when one was unconscious. The device at the side showed that he was unconscious. In truth, Sillin could have dodged the needle that would cause him to faint, but he did not because he had other considerations. The other party had a huge appetite. Not only did they take away Tang Qiuqiu, they seemed to have their eyes on Qifeng as well. Although Sillin had said those words to Cheto back in that corner, that wasn't his real goal. His communication with Hui Mao was far from that. Huimao was crouching on Silen's shoulder, so they did not need to talk at all. They were not afraid of being monitored. And Huimao could communicate with Cheto through another method. Before Qifeng fainted, Silen had secretly injected a kind of medicine into Qifeng's body. It was a medicine that Lycrabe had invented, and it could resist certain strong stimulants. Moreover, Silen had also added another medicine that would cause Qifeng to emit a kind of scent. As long as this scent was present, Silen would be able to track down Qifeng. After the spaceplane had entered the starship, Qifeng and Silen were separated. Qifeng was obviously under heavy surveillance, but Silen was placed in a separate room. He was the only one in the room, and there were surveillance devices all around him. Chapter 194. He was surrounded by reinforced steel walls, hidden firepower devices, and surveillance equipment with no blind spots. It was obvious that the people here were monitoring Silen very strictly. No, it should be said that the people here were monitoring their test subjects very strictly. Right now, Silen couldn't do anything. This place was too closely monitored, and Huimao and Cheto needed time to gather information. Otherwise, he would be too passive. Tang Qiuqiu was probably being monitored like Silen, and Xueqiu and Qifeng were being watched even more closely. That being said, they probably wouldn't do anything just yet. Silen needed to think about his next move during this time. The starship arrived at another planet in Sector I. The spaceport and orbiting satellites at the periphery of this planet had the same logo. Silen was transferred to a spaceplane and flown to the planet. There was a huge research base on the planet, and Silen was transported to one of the research bases. Here, there were some ordinary humans like Silen imprisoned. However, these people had already been injected with certain drugs. Some of them had grown scales on their bodies, some had grown spikes, and some had wrinkles all over their bodies. When Silen was transported to one of the surveillance rooms, one of these human test subjects went crazy due to the side effects of the drugs and slammed the walls around him. Every monitoring room was cylindrical, with a diameter of about 4 meters. 1/4 of the walls were adjusted to be transparent, so that the experimenters could see the reaction of the test subjects to the drugs, but the test subjects could not see each other. After Silen was scanned by a scanner, he was injected with drugs and thrown into a surveillance room. The monitor outside the room displayed the number 6915. This meant that Silen was the 6915th test subject of this kind of experiment. The people who dragged Silen and Qifeng from the port of the trading center to the spaceplane gave Silen a very strong feeling. The few people who came into contact with Silen had detected that their genes were different from a normal person's. They weren't pure human genes, and there were more or less genes of other races in them. Moreover, these people did not speak from the beginning to the end, only following orders. Just like a puppet. These people left after sending Silen over. The people walking inside were all scientists in white overalls. The drug injected into Silen's body was immediately analyzed by Silen. It was a drug to test his resistance and tolerance. The experimenters wanted to see how much he could endure. Silen knew that the entire monitoring room was a lab table. The moment he was thrown in, the experiment had begun. Since you want to see it, in a room not far from here, a monitor reflected the situation of each experiment table, and each experimental subject's reaction to the drug would be analyzed by the relevant equipment. One of the experimenters looked at the monitor and exclaimed in surprise. Test subject 6915's body temperature is abnormal. It's dropping rapidly after being heated up. That's impossible. The people in here all have A-rank genes. How can this one not even last 5 minutes? Another experimenter said. The data shows that his body temperature is dropping rapidly and has already reached the critical point. If it goes any lower, this test subject will be useless. Something's wrong. His body temperature is rising again. There's a strong rejection reaction. His blood flow is increasing, and his heart is beating rapidly. In the monitor, Silen had already begun to twitch. The various data displayed on the monitoring device for Silen was changing violently. This meant that the monitoring subject's various vital signs were extremely unstable, and the entire internal system was in chaos. The experimenters had already predicted what would happen next. 10 seconds later, the device showed that his heart had stopped beating. Half an hour later, it was still the same. That's enough. Just get rid of him, one of the researchers said expressionlessly. They had seen this kind of thing many times in this place. How's the blood test for 6915? All the DNA has been broken down. We don't know why, but it might be the effect of the drug. A-rank genes are troublesome. All sorts of situations can happen, one of the experimenters muttered. There's no other way. The test subjects must be A-rank genes. But isn't this guy too weak? Even the kid from last time was more capable than him. And he still managed to hold on for an hour. All in all, this A-rank gene test subject is a piece of trash. I really don't know where Shelt got him from. Sillin, who was lying there quietly without any signs of life, was put into a long bag and transported out of this area to a waste treatment plant. This waste treatment plant was divided into 2 treatment boxes. One was used to deal with experimental equipment and related drugs, and the other was used to deal with failed test subjects. One of the experimenters dragged Sillin from the transport rack to the table in front of the treatment box. Just as he was about to press the treatment button, a hand suddenly reached out from the bag with a thin needle in it. Before the experimenter could react, the thin needle had already been inserted into the back of his head. The needle was previously hidden in the ring with a curly leaf pattern, so the scanning device had not detected it. The drug on the needle quickly entered the experimenter's brain through the blood, and the brain nerves began to be affected by this drug. Sillin opened the bag and stood in front of the experimenter. His voice became low and slow, and there was a certain rhythm and bewitchment in it. Remember, you've already disposed of the dead. The experimenter's eyes were unfocused as he repeated Sillin's words blankly. I've already disposed of the dead. So now go out, find a place to sleep, and start your new job. Sleep, start my new job. After watching the experimenter walk out of the treatment plant, Sillin pressed the button next to the table in front of the treatment box. The table entered the treatment box, and a white light flashed from inside. The entire bag was instantly reduced to dust, and the table returned to its original position after the treatment was done. Sillin looked up at the monitors above the treatment plant, but he did not avoid them. Instead he asked, have you finished processing the footage? It's done. I guarantee that no one will find out. Huimao walked in from outside with Cheto behind him. Cheto projected light from his eyes and formed many images in front of him. He cut out a portion of the footage related to Tang Qiuqiu, Xueqiu, and Qifeng and played it back to Cheto. Miracle Corporation? Sillin looked a little surprised when he saw the logo. There were a lot of base companies that conducted biochemical or genetic experiments, but very few of them were like Miracle Corporation. Miracle Corporation's backer was very strong. Not only were they supported by business organizations, political organizations, and even the League of Stars' military. A company like this was something that no hunter regiment would want to come into contact with. It was because their background was enough to know that they were involved in a lot of shady transactions and experiments. As a member of the 4 great hunter regiments, a simple analysis was enough to understand why no one wanted to come into contact with Miracle Corporation. There was a dividing line between hunters, political organizations, and the military. It was a balance of non-interference, and on both sides of this point of balance, both sides would sneer at each other. Everyone knew each other's background and the dirty things that were going on behind their backs, and they just kept their mouths shut. With such a deep background, it was easy to imagine just how high the company's profits were. Even if their experiments were illegal and shameful, Miracle Corporation could still create a bright side for the company. Miracle Corporation's high-end biochemical weapons and genetic drugs were famous in the League of Stars. Many people knew about these 2 things, and it was said that Miracle's genetic drug had the highest success rate in the entire League of Stars. At the same time, it was also the most expensive drug. But under the glorious image of this drug with the highest success rate, how many innocent people had to pay with their lives? Xueqiu and Qifeng were sent to the other side of the base, but Tang Qiuqiu isn't far from where you were locked up, Huimao said while staring at the images. The gray cat stared at the images and said, "But Sillin, we discovered that there's another group of people here. We discovered them when we were copying some of the base's surveillance footage. Although they're very well hidden, they still can't escape my cat eyes." "Do you know which side they are from?" Huimao shook his head. "I don't know. But you said before that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We can work together. Don't make contact with them for now. We'll decide after we find Qiu and the others. These people must have their reasons for not making a move all this time." Rescuing Tang Qiu was easy enough, and Huimao and Cheto could take care of the security system as well. However, rescuing Tang Qiu would definitely alert the enemy, and it wouldn't be as easy to deal with Qifeng and Xueqiu on the other side of the base. Judging from the images Cheto provided, the place where Qifeng and Xueqiu were being held was even more heavily guarded. While Sillin was deep in thought, Cheto suddenly said, "There's a non-member of the base at the entrance of the passage 500 meters away. He's copying the footage here. I'll go over and take a look first. You guys keep an eye on Tang Qiuqiu's situation, and cut off all the power systems in this area if you notice anything amiss." "Is it difficult?" "No," Cheto and Huimao said in unison. If it were anyone else, they would probably laugh at them for overestimating themselves, but it wasn't impossible for Cheto and Huimao to do so. Sillin snuck over to the place Cheto pointed out. Thanks to Cheto's help, Sillin didn't encounter any obstacles along the way, and he was able to pass through without needing to verify his identity. When he arrived at the passage, Sillin saw the person on the other side. The person looked similar to the researchers he saw earlier. He was wearing white work clothes and gloves, and his back was facing Sillin. He was fiddling with a medicine rack, and it looked like he was preparing to transport the medicine to the processing box. However, a couple of medicine boxes had fallen to the ground, and he was picking them up right now. He didn't sense any nervousness or urgency. He was very calm, and he looked just like any other researcher in this base. As Sillin approached, the person still didn't show any nervousness or killing intent. Sillin didn't stop after he got close to the person. Instead, he continued to walk forward, and the person was still crouching and sorting out the medicine boxes that had fallen to the ground. Sillin took a few more steps after he passed by the person. Suddenly, he came to a stop and turned around, saying, "Hey, did you know that these two dangerous medicines are usually transported by robots?" Chapter 195. Sillin had just finished speaking when 3 pillbox fragments shot straight at him. They were aimed at Sillin's eyes, heart, and kidneys respectively. At the same time the 3 fragments shot towards him, the person had already arrived. In the eyes of an ordinary person, they wouldn't even be able to see an afterimage. Sillin was already prepared when he said those words. It was just that this person gave him a very familiar feeling. After dodging the 3 fragments, Sillin raised his hand to block the fist that was coming at him. The moment his hand and the fist came into contact, Sillin immediately knew who the person in front of him was. Knight. The person in front of him was about to continue his attack, but was stopped by this voice. Knight swiftly retreated to 10 meters away and stared at Sillin warily. He didn't recognize Sillin. After all, Sillin's appearance was too different from when he was at 7 Lights. "Who are you?" Knight's silent stinger was already at the ready when he asked the question. As long as the person wasn't one of his own, he would attack immediately. Knight's reaction was understandable. He remembered everyone who came here with him very well, and he could recognize them even if they were in disguise. But this person in front of him, Knight was sure that he didn't know the person when they first met, but he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity after the first exchange. Now it seemed that the familiarity grew stronger the further he looked, but there was no such person in his memories. Moreover, the person in front of him didn't have any malicious intent, and the way he looked at him was like someone who was extremely familiar with him. Who is this person? Knight was conflicted. Sillin let out a low chuckle. "I knew you wouldn't recognize me." It was at this moment Huimao jumped out. "Hey Sillin, what's going on? Something's wrong over there. Should we start a power cut?" The moment he heard the name Sillin, the corner of Knight's eyes twitched. Then his eyes slowly widened and stared at Sillin. He froze on the spot as if he didn't know how to react. Sillin walked around Knight and looked at the display on Cheto's hand. In the video, a few researchers had already entered the room where Tang Kakikyu was locked up, and they were holding syringes and tubes in their hands. Just as Sillin was about to speak, Knight came over with a dark expression. "Don't worry, we have people there." As he spoke, Knight tapped a small disc in his hand a few times. That was the code used by their operation team to communicate with each other. Sillin nodded, indicating that there was no need to cut off the power. Let's observe the situation first. Seeing how Sillin believed him so easily, Huimao tilted his head and looked at Knight. "Who's this enemy's enemy?" "Just like Lung, my roommate back then." Nat Huimao's eyes lit up when he heard that it was the same as Lung. He jumped over and patted Knight's body with his paw. "Oh, so it's one of us." "Oh. Why was there a cat here?" Knight moved his gaze backward and looked at Cheto. "And who is this?" Before Sillin could answer, Huimao cut in. "His name is Cheto. We're on the same team." "Cheto? I thought of Shadow X." Sillin looked at Huimao. "See, I told you Shadow X was a good name." Knight raised his fist and pressed it against Sillin's head. "Good my ass. How dare you say that, you bastard." If it wasn't for the environment and the situation, Knight would have beaten him up a long time ago. Back then, Sillin's method of leaving had pissed him off for more than 10 days. Even now he still had to vent that anger. After this incident was over, he would definitely beat up this cunning bastard. He knew that this bastard was infuriating from the first time he met him. "You guys tampered with the surveillance cameras, didn't you?" Knight asked. Although it was a question, his words were very certain. Tampering with the surveillance cameras in this place wasn't something an ordinary person could do. Not even their operation team could do it. At most, they could duplicate the surveillance footage. Knight had a palm-sized device in his hand. With this device, they didn't need to go to the guardhouse to duplicate the recordings of all the surveillance cameras within a 500-meter radius. But they didn't expect Sillin's group to be even more amazing. They could even tamper with the surveillance footage of this area. One had to know that Miracle's surveillance network was very high-end. "Why are you guys here?" Sillin asked. "You know a bit about Miracle's background, don't you? They've gone too far in the past few years, and there are people above us who can't stand it. Moreover, a couple of Miracle's backstage people have fallen recently, and someone wants to perform a major surgery on Miracle. That's why we accepted the mission and came here to collect evidence." They didn't know it before they came here, but not a single one of them could calm down after they saw what had happened. In the past, most of the experiments they saw were conducted on animals. But in this place, it was basically all humans, and the animals were all very rare and precious beasts. As for the experimental subjects, from the undifferentiated embryos to people of all ages, they were all subjected to extremely cruel treatment. The experimenters didn't care about their lives. If they could exchange it for a considerable amount of data, they wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice a few lives, dozens of lives, or even thousands of innocent lives. If they couldn't find any volunteers, they would rob or kidnap them. They had once seen a newborn baby bleed to death because of the metabolic disorder caused by the injection of the drug. It was then thrown away like garbage by the experimenters. Later, they killed 2 experimenters, and 2 of their companions disguised themselves as the 2 experimenters. The person who was injecting Tang Kakikyu was one of his companions. "Sillin, did you know? Back then, I had always admired those researchers because of C.I. Jincheng and Old Mo. But after seeing these people, I feel that these people should be exterminated." At the same time, Tang Qiuqiu was locked in a cylindrical room similar to the surveillance room Sillin was locked in. The people locked here were all young children, and most of them were kidnapped. The experimental subject is showing signs of waking up, but her mobility hasn't recovered yet. Continue injecting the drug. Tang Qiuqiu listened to the unfamiliar voices around her. She opened her eyes and saw a few people in white work clothes. One of them was holding a syringe and a tube, while the other 2 were adjusting the equipment. They actually brought a non-ranked child here this time. But this child's resistance to drugs is pretty good, so she should be a good experimental subject. Tang Qiuqiu wanted to move, but found that she had lost control of all her muscles, and even breathing was a bit difficult. Now Tang Qiuqiu's vision was very clear. Although she couldn't move, her mind was very clear. She didn't scream after seeing the unfamiliar environment around her. Instead, she stayed silent. Sillin told her that the more dangerous the situation was, the calmer she should be. But after all, she was a child. When she saw the syringe, she tried her best to move her arm away, but she still couldn't move. The person who injected her pierced the syringe into her arm and injected the red liquid inside. She could feel that the liquid began to flow to all parts of her body. However, to Tang Qiuqiu's confusion, when she looked up, she saw the experimenter who injected her winking at her. There was a smile in his eyes, but it wasn't evil, more like a kind of encouragement. Not long after the experimenters left, Tang Qiuqiu began to feel allergic all over her body. Her body temperature rose sharply, and it didn't take long for her heart to stop beating. An experimenter looked at the data displayed on the monitor and sneered. "Tisk, garbage genes are garbage genes." Sure enough, children who don't have A-rank genes have better effects. Hurry up and dispose of it, don't waste the drug. So Tang Qiuqiu, like Sillin, was sent to the waste disposal site as a failed experimental subject. This time, Sillin's actions were even faster. He still used hypnosis on the experimenters who sent the failed products. He didn't want to make a scene just yet. Perhaps these people would remember some fragments in the near future, but by then, it would be in the past, and it would be useless to remember. Sillin opened the bag, and Knight injected another drug into Tang Qiuqiu. A few seconds later, Tang Qiuqiu's heart began to beat again, and then all her vital signs began to recover. "Big brother Sillin, they took Qiuqiu away," Tang Qiuqiu said with red eyes. It was all because of her gluttony that things had become like this. After knowing that Qifeng was also taken away, Tang Qiuqiu felt even more guilty. Sillin rubbed Tang Qiuqiu's head. "This isn't your fault. They had their eyes on Qiuqiu for a long time. Even if they didn't take it now, they would have taken it in the future. They took my gun and my badge. It's fine, we'll just take it back." As he said that, Sillin looked at Knight. "Do you have more guns?" When people in the military moved, their equipment was definitely customized according to the mission, and it was much easier to move around here with specially made guns. Knight directly threw his own gun to Sillin, but he didn't expect Sillin to give it to Tang Qiuqiu. However, Knight only raised his eyebrows and said nothing. Although he didn't understand why a gun was given to a child, it wasn't the time to argue about it. "I'll bring you to our current base, and we'll discuss the next step of the plan there. The key research lab over at the base isn't easy to enter, and there's nothing we can do even if we're in a hurry. We haven't made any substantial progress after so long. But the good news is that according to the information we received, due to the lack of a certain reagent, the research on the beasts has been suspended. We have at least 30 hours. After 30 hours, the reagent they bought will be delivered here. Once the reagent arrives, your two companions will be injected with the drug, and they'll basically be puppets. Those who can't become puppets will be directly obliterated. 30 hours. Time was of the essence. Knight brought Sillin and the others to a small room in the base. It wasn't a remote area at the edge of the base, but a dormitory for technical staff. The researcher who originally lived here had been killed by Knight and the others, and one of them took over the identity of the researcher. However, there was no lack of talents in the military to be able to take over someone's identity without revealing any flaws. When Sillin arrived, he unexpectedly saw two familiar people. Although they hadn't seen each other for 3 years, and these people had also disguised themselves, Sillin still recognized them at first glance. "You Lu Feng Haichao, long time no see." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.